Oh, stumbling upon this hidden refuge is no accident. Perhaps the Emperor himself guided your steps here. Follow me, sit beside the fire, and take some rest. There's a long road ahead of you among the stars, so feel free to ease your mind and listen to my tales. Tonight, I'll take you to a single world that has drowned in blood 3 times over. A hive world of ash and industry, of towering cities and endless factories, where the Imperium has bled against daemons and greenskins alike. They call this place Armageddon, and its name has become a byword for apocalyptic war. So settle in, and let me tell you the complete story of its many wars. To understand the wars, we must first understand the prize that everyone fought so hard to claim. Armageddon sits within the Segmentum Solar, the great region of the galaxy that surrounds Holy Terra itself, and that placement alone made the world precious in the eyes of the Imperium. It is a hive world, one of countless planets where humanity has crammed itself into towering cities that stretch from the ground into the clouds, and its manufactorums churn out weapons, tanks and munitions that supply imperial armies across the whole sector. Billions upon billions of souls live and toil here, born into the smoke, raised amid the clanging of machines, and buried in the ash when their labor finally ends. The world itself is a harsh place. Great swaths of Armageddon are covered in ash wastes, wide grey plains where the wind carries grit and cinders across the ground for hundreds of miles. Volcanoes rumble beneath the crust, and in some regions the land turns to molten rock and searing heat that the people simply call the fire wastes. Between the 2 main population centers lies a dense equatorial jungle, a green belt of poisonous plants and choking humidity that splits the main continent into 2 halves. Those 2 halves carry names that anyone who studies the wars will come to know well. To the west lies Armageddon Prime, and to the east lies Armageddon Secundus, separated by that vast tangle of jungle and the winding rivers that cut through it. Across these lands rise the hive cities, and their names read like a roll of grim titles. There is Hades' Hive, a fortress of industry that would one day become the anvil upon which a great enemy broke his strength. There is Hell's Reach, a port city on the coast, and Infernus, and Acheron, and Tartarus, each one a mountain of steel and stone, packed with humanity. Great walls surround them, and within those walls the people live layer upon layer, the wealthy near the top where the air is cleaner, and the poor crammed into the lower depths where the smoke never lifts and the machines never sleep. The whole world groans under the weight of its own labor, feeding the imperial war effort without pause or rest. For all its ugliness, Armageddon mattered. A single hive world of this size could arm entire crusades, and its loss would ripple outward across 100 neighboring systems that depended on its factories. The Imperium understood this well, and so it garrisoned the planet, raised regiments from its people, and watched over it as one watches over a treasure that many others would gladly steal. The most famous of those regiments were the Armageddon Steel Legion, tank-riding soldiers bred to the ash and trained to fight across the open wastes, and they would spill oceans of blood defending their home in the years to come. Yet the very things that made Armageddon valuable also made it a target. A world so rich in industry, so packed with souls, so central to the Imperium's strength, drew the hungry gaze of powers that wished to see it burn. Some of those powers came from the mortal galaxy, savage and green, and endless in number. Others came from beyond the veil of reality itself, from the churning nightmare realm where daemons dwell and fallen gods whisper. 3 times these forces would descend upon the Ash world, and 3 times its people would fight for their lives against foes that most human worlds never even dreamed of facing. The first of those enemies would not come with fleets of ships or armies marching across the plains. It would come from within, seated quietly in the shadows of the hive cities, waiting for a warp storm to gather and a fallen son of a god to arrive. Long before the greenskins ever set eyes on Armageddon, a darker thing stirred in the depths of the Eye of Terror, and it set its course for this world of ash and fire. In the year 444 of the 41st millennium, Angron sat upon a throne of skulls on a demon world deep within the Eye of Terror. He was a demon prince, the fallen primarch of the World Eaters' Legion, and the favored champion of the blood god Khorne. Angron possessed a massive, hunched frame covered in blood-red skin, thick iron cables driven into his skull, and heavy plates of brass armor bolted directly into his flesh. He wielded a sword forged from black iron, a blade large enough to cleave an armored tank in two, and his voice sounded like grinding metal and snapping bones. For thousands of years, Angron had gathered the scattered remnants of his 12 legion. During a conflict on the ice world of Scalathrax long ago, the World Eaters had fractured. As temperatures on Scalathrax dropped cold enough to shatter ceramite armor, the legionaries sought shelter. A warrior named Khan took up a heavy flamer and walked through the camps, burning the shelters to the ground and forcing his brothers to fight the enemy and each other to keep warm in the blistering frost. The Legion broke apart that night. Small warbands scattered across the galaxy, painting their armor red and fighting isolated skirmishes. Angron sought to bring these broken warbands back together into a single cohesive force capable of striking the segmentum solar. He sent emissaries across the warp, demanding his son's return to his banner. Slowly, they gathered as Chaos Space Marines bearing chain axes and bolters arrived on his daemon world. Cultists covered in freshly carved scarification rituals pitched tents of flayed skin across the plains, while demons with leathery wings and brazen hooves materialized in the blood-soaked mud. To move this massive army, Angron required a transport vessel of unimaginable scale. A space hulk named the Devourer of Stars drifted into the orbit of his demon world. The space hulk consisted of dozens of ruined battleships, civilian freighters, and hollowed-out asteroids, all fused together by localized gravity and freezing void ice over millennia. Jagged metal spines protruded from its surface, and the wrecked prows of ancient vessels jutted out at odd angles. Furthermore, the internal corridors formed a labyrinth of rusted bulkheads, flickering lumen strips, and leaking plasma conduits. Millions of warriors boarded the Devourer of Stars. Transport shuttles and boarding torpedoes slammed into the outer hull, disgorging hordes of cultists and world eaters into the dark passageways. Beastmen with heavy horns and cloven hooves packed into the lower cargo bays, and mutants dragged artillery pieces and supply crates across the grated floors. Daemons manifested directly in the engineering decks, warping the metal and leaving trails of sulfur and boiling blood. Angron himself took position in the central command spire, surrounded by 12 bloodthirsters, massive daemons of Khorne, carrying axes the size of drop pods. The Devourer of Stars crossed into the immaterium, moving through the churning currents of the warp. Outside the viewports, the void shifted into swirling streams of violet and red energy. The raw matter of the warp battered against the Geller fields, the protective energy bubbles shielding the physical mass of the hulk. Inside, the World Eaters sharpened their weapons on grinding stones, the sparks illuminating the dark holds. Cultists chanted loudly, their voices echoing through miles of ventilation shafts. The mass of the hulk drifted along the psychic tides generated by Khorne's will, moving steadily toward the segmentum solar. The journey took months of real time, and as they neared their destination, the sheer mass of the hulk and the concentrated psychic energy of millions of blood-crazed worshippers generated a localized warp storm. The storm manifested as violent tears in real space, spilling multicolored lightning across the void and disrupting astropathic communications across the sector. The devourer of stars emerged into the physical universe on the edge of the Armageddon system. Before the hulk even breached the planet's orbit, the effects of its approach materialized on the surface of Armageddon itself. Deep within the underhives of Armageddon Prime and Armageddon Secundus, men and women in tattered overalls gathered in maintenance tunnels. They dragged crates of stolen autoguns and sharpened crude machetes. They carved 8-pointed stars into the ferrocrete walls using plasma cutters and their own blood, signaling that the uprising was ready to begin. The rebellion erupted in the claustrophobic depths of Hive Infernus, when workers turned their heavy smelting tools on the factory overseers. Blood pooled on the grated floors as thousands of men and women surged upward from the manufactorum levels. They carried stolen autoguns, jagged metal pipes, and chain blades stripped from industrial saws. Along the main transit arteries, they clashed with the Hive enforcers. The enforcers fired riot shotguns into the advancing crowds, blowing large holes in the front ranks. The mob trampled over the mangled bodies of their co-workers, surging forward to tear the enforcers apart with bare hands and crude blunt weapons. Simultaneously, identical violent uprisings broke out in Hive Acheron, Tartarus, and Hades. Cultists detonated explosive charges along Prometheum pipelines, sending massive geysers of liquid flame up the sides of the towering hab blocks. Black smoke filled the upper spires, coating the luxury estates in thick layers of greasy soot and choking out the recycled air. The rebels erected barricades of crushed transport haulers, ripped ferrocrete blocks, and twisted steel beams across the primary intersections. They dragged captured planetary officials to these barricades and severed their heads with heavy cleavers, mounting the dripping skulls on rusted iron spikes along the defensive lines. Above the planet, the upper atmosphere shifted violently. The thick grey smog parted as swirling streaks of crimson and bruised purple light dominated the sky. Lightning arced between the massive hive spires, striking the metal plating and showering bright white sparks down into the streets below. Voxcaster networks across the planet emitted bursts of high-pitched static and guttural roaring, severing all communication with the orbital defense platforms. The warp storm blanketed the entire Armageddon system, trapping the planet inside a sphere of churning multicolored energy and physically blocking all astropathic transmissions to the wider Imperium. Planetary commanders deployed the Armageddon Defense Force to suppress the riots. Chimeras and Lehman Russ battle tanks rolled down the wide transport avenues, crushing debris, burning vehicles, and barricades beneath their heavy treads. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers marched into the lower hab levels, firing bright red las beams into the shadowed corridors. The sheer scale of the simultaneous uprisings forced the military leaders to divide their regiments. Armored columns spread out across the ash wastes, traveling hundreds of miles through choking dust storms to reach the besieged hive cities. Infantry battalions separated into smaller squads to clear individual hab blocks, stretching their supply lines and heavily thinning their defensive perimeters. Inside the command bunkers, soldiers tightened their grips on their weapons and constantly checked their flanks. Sergeants inspected the armor of their subordinates, looking for freshly carved eight-pointed stars or strange brands burned into their flesh. Commissars pressed the barrels of their bolt pistols against the temples of officers who delayed their firing orders, pulling the triggers and leaving bodies slumped over the glowing tactical displays. In the narrow transit tunnels, PDF squads encountered other loyalist units and immediately opened fire, reacting to the flashing muzzle flares in the gloom. Blood coated the walls of the bunkers and the command posts as internal purges and crossfire incidents decimated the leadership structure. The cultists fought with a frenzied, single-minded focus on slaughter. They charged directly into the overlapping fields of heavy bolter fire, letting the explosive rounds rip through their torsos and sever their limbs. Survivors climbed over the mounting piles of shredded flesh to strike at the loyalist gunners with knives and bare teeth. They gathered the bodies of the fallen from both sides, dragging them by their boots into the center of the plazas. There, they hacked off the heads and stacked them into towering pyramids of bone and cartilage. They dipped their hands into the pooling blood and smeared thick red streaks across the metal bulkheads, covering the Imperial eagles with the brutal runes of the blood god. The planetary forces exhausted their ammunition and manpower fighting street to street, completely absorbed by the endless waves of deranged cultists. The defenders focused all their attention on the ground, pointing their macro cannons down the avenues and locking their anti-aircraft batteries in a forward-firing position to level entire hab blocks. They committed every reserve unit to the meat grinder of the underhives. High above the localized carnage, the crimson clouds began to boil and part. The heavy atmospheric pressure pushed down on the hive spires, rattling the reinforced glass of the upper observation decks. A massive shadow eclipsed the purple lightning, descending slowly toward the surface of Armageddon Prime. The jagged hull of the Devourer of Stars breached the lower atmosphere, bringing the true horde directly to the war-torn world. The sky above Armageddon Prime tore open, and a jagged rift of violet energy spilled across the grey clouds. The Devourer of Stars pushed its massive bulk through the tear in reality, eclipsing the system's sun and casting a shadow that covered hundreds of miles of the ash wastes. The space hulk's metal structure screeched and buckled under the planet's gravity, shedding frozen void ice and chunks of rusted metal that burned up in the atmosphere. From the underside of the massive amalgamation of ships, thousands of boarding torpedoes, drop pods, and heavily armored bulk landers detached and plummeted toward the surface. The drop pods slammed into the ferrocrete avenues and the outer industrial sectors of Armageddon Prime, cracking the ground and sending shockwaves through the hab blocks. The heavy iron ramps dropped open, and the World Eaters charged out into the smoke. They wore thick ceramite armor, painted the color of fresh blood, and trimmed with tarnished brass. The motorized teeth of their chain axes spun up to speed with a loud, grinding mechanical roar, and the Chaos Space Marines swung the heavy weapons directly into the ranks of the waiting enforcers. Metal teeth shredded flak armor, splintered ribs, and sprayed blood across the paved streets. Behind the Chaos Space Marines, the landing craft disgorged a massive horde. Cultists covered in freshly carved scars fired autoguns wildly into the crowds of fleeing workers. Mutants dragged themselves forward on asymmetrical limbs, crushing skulls with oversized, muscular fists. Beastmen with curved horns and cloven hooves trampled over the fallen, thrusting iron-tipped spears through the chests of the wounded. Daemon hosts floated above the blood-soaked ground, bound in heavy iron chains that rattled against their flesh, projecting arcs of purple lightning that set the surrounding buildings on fire. Daemons with brass-scaled skin and leathery wings poured out of the landing ships, snapping their jaws and swinging blades forged from blackened warp iron. Specific traitor contingents carved their own paths through the hive cities. Angron's chosen marched in bulky Terminator armor, absorbing the bright lasfire that scored their shoulder plates, and used heavy chain fists to rip the turrets off Leman Russ battle tanks. The warbands known as the Forsworn and Lord Skrellic's Elite advanced down the main transit corridors, firing mass reactive bolt rounds that detonated inside the bodies of the defenders, leaving scattered red paste on the walls. The Skull Takers followed close behind, severing the heads of the dead and chaining the trophies to their power packs. Towering above the infantry lines, the traitor Titan legions made their landfall from massive bulk transports. These gigantic mechanical walkers crushed entire hab blocks beneath their metal feet. Spiked armor plates covered their chassis, and dark red light glowed from their command viewports. They leveled their plasma destructors at the primary defense bastions, unleashing blasts of superheated energy that melted the reinforced ferrocrete into bubbling pools of glowing slag and incinerated the soldiers manning the walls. Inside the command bunkers and defense lines of Armageddon Prime, the planetary defense network collapsed from the inside. Nearly half of the Armageddon Planetary Defense Force turned their weapons on their own officers. Soldiers in green flak armor raised their lasguns and shot their comrades in the back. The mutineers ripped the silver Imperial Eagles from their uniforms and used the blood of the Loyalists to paint the 8-pointed star of chaos on their chest plates. These traitor guardsmen marched to the heavy blast doors of the secondary hives, overriding the locking mechanisms and pulling the gates wide open. They stood aside and let the World Eaters walk directly into the lower levels, leaving the heavy macro cannons completely silent. During the opening weeks of the invasion, the World Eaters and their demonic allies butchered millions of citizens across Armageddon Prime. Chain axes tore through flesh and bone continuously, and the sheer volume of blood overflowed the municipal drainage grates, creating dark red streams that ran down the sloping streets. Cultists dragged the bodies of the slain into the center of the plazas, stacking the corpses into massive barricades and setting them on fire. The smell of roasting meat, melting plastic, and burning promethium filled the hive cities, replacing the usual smog with a thick, greasy black smoke that blanketed the spires. Loyalist guardsmen left their defensive trenches and bunkers. They threw their empty lasguns onto the cracked pavement and sprinted down the transport corridors. Chimeras and supply trucks smashed through the remaining southern hive gates, speeding out onto the open ash wastes. The surviving regiments drove their vehicles steadily south, keeping their eyes on the horizon ahead. They moved directly toward the equatorial jungle, driving their transports into the thick, humid canopy of poisonous vines and massive green ferns. The soldiers pushed through the dense foliage and humid air, taking cover beneath the jungle canopy to regroup on the riverbanks of the Armageddon Secundus border. The surviving guardsmen from Armageddon Prime pushed through the equatorial jungle. Thick green ferns and broad-leafed vines slapped against their armored transports. Tracks sank deep into the black mud, churning up roots and stagnant water. They reached the banks of the River Styx, a massive, sluggish waterway separating the northern and southern landmasses. Units from Armageddon Secundus waited on the southern banks. Engineers drove steel pylons into the mud to support floating pontoon bridges, allowing the battered chimeras and exhausted infantry to cross. Once the refugees passed, sappers placed explosive charges on the pylons, detonating them to send the metal bridges crashing into the murky water. Along the southern shoreline, the Armageddon Steel Legion prepared their defensive lines. These soldiers wore mustard-yellow trench coats caked with grey ash and thick mud. Circular rebreather masks covered their faces, blocking the jungle spores and the drifting smog from the northern hive cities. They dug deep trenches into the soil, reinforcing the walls with corrugated iron sheets and sandbags. Heavy bolter teams mounted their weapons on tripod stands overlooking the river. Rows of Lehman Russ demolisher tanks idled behind the earthworks, their massive plasma cannons glowing with contained thermal energy. The soldiers checked their charge packs, slotted combat blades onto their lasguns, and kept their eyes fixed on the northern tree line. The jungle across the river shifted and tore apart. World Eaters in red ceramite burst from the tree line, firing bolt rounds across the water. The explosive shells struck the southern trenches, throwing geysers of mud and human limbs into the air. Daemons with brass-scaled bodies waded directly into the river Styx. The water boiled around their superheated flesh, sending thick clouds of white steam rolling across the surface. Bloodletters swung jagged black swords, deflecting lasfire as they climbed up the muddy southern banks. The Steel Legion gunners squeezed their triggers, unleashing streams of heavy bolter fire that tore large chunks of meat from the charging mutants. The Chaos forces slammed into the Imperial lines. Chain axes tore through the ferrocrete bunkers, ripping the roofs off and shredding the soldiers inside. Blood sprayed across the yellow trench coats of the Steel Legion guardsmen. The defenders drove their bayonets into the gaps of the Chaos Space Marines' armor, twisting the blades into the muscle beneath. Demons grabbed the barrels of the Imperial tanks, crushing the metal with their bare hands and tearing the hatch covers off to slaughter the crews inside. The smell of sulfur, spilled blood, and burning promethium hung thick over the riverbanks. Piles of severed limbs and crushed torsos filled the trenches, forcing the surviving guardsmen to stand on the bodies of their squad mates to keep firing. Deep within the central command spires of Armageddon Secundus, Imperial officials recognized the collapse of the river defenses. In a circular chamber lined with copper wire and purity seals, a choir of astropaths sat in high-backed iron chairs. Their eyes were fused shut, and their skin stretched tightly over their skulls. The chief astropath gripped the arms of his chair, blood dripping from his nostrils and ears as he focused his mind. He projected a concentrated psychic signal directly through the warp storm enveloping the planet. The signal pushed into the immaterium, transmitting the exact coordinates of Armageddon and a request for heavy military reinforcement. Several astropaths slumped forward in their chairs, their brains hemorrhaging from the physical strain of pushing the message through the chaotic warp currents. The message traveled outward across the segmentum solar. On the ground, the Steel Legion fired their remaining power packs and drew their combat knives as the massive red form of Angron stepped onto the southern bank. The Daemon Primarch swung his black iron blade, cleaving through 3 Lehman Russ tanks in a single arc. The Imperial commanders watched the tactical displays turn red as their battalions vanished from the screens. Standard infantry and armor possessed just enough firepower to momentarily slow a towering monster of Angron's sheer mass and warp-infused strength. Only the most heavily armored and genetically enhanced warriors of the Emperor possessed the physical capability to strike down a Daemon Primarch. The astropathic signal reached the navigation arrays of heavily armed strike cruisers moving through the void, drawing the attention of 2 distinct Space Marine chapters. The strike cruisers dropped from the warp in flashes of blinding white light, entering the upper orbit of Armageddon Secundus. The lead vessels bore the iconography of a snarling wolf's head, painted over slate-gray hulls. These ships carried the entirety of the Space Wolves chapter, thousands of genetically engineered warriors clad in thick ceramite armor, draped with the pelts of Fenrisian beasts. Drop pods, detached from the launch bays, streaking down through the red-tinged atmosphere and leaving thick trails of exhaust smoke. Thunderhawk gunships followed close behind, their heavy engines roaring as they breached the cloud cover. The drop pods smashed into the mud of the river Styx and the surrounding jungle, blowing their explosive bolts to deploy the Space Wolves directly into the flanks of the Chaos Horde. The warriors stepped out into the humid air, revealing sharp canine teeth and golden eyes. They swung frost axes with glowing blue edges and fired heavy bolters that shredded the bare-chested cultists. Alongside the Space Wolves' fleet, a single silver-hulled strike cruiser hung in orbit. This vessel belonged to the Grey Knights, a clandestine chapter of Space Marines created specifically to eradicate demonic incursions. Inside the staging chambers of this cruiser, 109 warriors donned bulky Terminator armor. The suits consisted of layered silver ceramite, covered in purity seals, wax strips, and engraved protective runes. Small censers swung from their shoulder pauldrons, trailing thick white incense smoke that coated the grated floors. Each Grey Knight wielded a Nemesis Force halberd with a crackling energy blade and wore a storm bolter mounted directly to the wrist of his gauntlet. They gathered in the teleportarium, standing on circular brass platforms intricately carved with warding circles, while thick metal grills covered their faces. On the ground, the Imperial counterattack commenced with brutal coordination. The Space Wolves charged the World Eaters, their frost blades meeting the red-painted chain axes in sprays of yellow sparks and chipped metal. The Space Marines drove their armored shoulders into the chest plates of the Chaos Legionaries, knocking them into the churning mud. Behind the Space Wolves, the surviving Steel Legion armored companies advanced out of their trench lines. The Lehman Russ Demolisher tanks fired high-explosive shells into the dense packs of bloodletters, blasting craters in the riverbank and sending geysers of boiling water high into the air. The combined assault broke the momentum of the Chaos forces, forcing the Horde to turn and fight on multiple fronts as the Space Wolves carved a bloody path through the cultists. In the center of the battlefield, Angron waded through the ruins of the Imperial defensive lines. The Daemon Primarch swung his black iron sword through the turrets of the Imperial tanks, tearing the armored roofs away and exposing the screaming crews inside. Around him marched his personal bodyguard, the Cruor Praetoria. This retinue consisted of 12 bloodthirsters, towering demons of Khorne with bodies covered in brass scales and thick whipcord muscles. They possessed heavy leathery wings that snapped in the wind, and they carried long iron whips that wrapped around the bodies of the fleeing guardsmen. The demons yanked their whips backward, dragging the soldiers into the spinning teeth of their massive battle axes. The hooves of the Cruor Praetoria crushed the ferrocrete bunkers into grey dust, and their deep roars shook the leaves from the surrounding jungle canopy. The Imperial commanders recognized the physical difficulty of breaking through the demonic bodyguard with conventional artillery. Consequently, the coordinated strike focused entirely on isolating the Daemon Primarch. The Space Wolves pushed harder against the flanks, drawing the attention of the World Eaters and the lesser daemons away from the center of the battlefield. The grey armored warriors shouted battle cries over the roar of the tank engines, continuously firing their bolters into the advancing hordes of beastmen. This maneuver created a momentary ring of open ground around Angron and his 12 bloodthirsters, leaving them surrounded by crushed vehicles and the mangled bodies of the Steel Legion. High in orbit, The Grey Knights finalized their preparations. The teleportarium machinery hummed with escalating electrical power, vibrating the deck plates of the strike cruiser. Arc lightning leaped between the heavy copper coils lining the walls, illuminating the silver armor of the Terminators. The Grey Knight Justicars raised their halberds, locking the activation triggers on their wrist-mounted storm bolters and planting their heavy magnetic boots firmly on the brass plates. The teleportarium engaged, emitting a blinding flash of silver light that completely consumed the room. The air displacement created a sharp sonic boom within the chamber as the warriors transported from the ship. Down on the blood-soaked banks of the River Styx, the space directly in front of Angron and the Cruor Praetoria tore open. Brilliant silver lightning cascaded across the mud, vaporizing the puddles of stagnant water. The 109 Grey Knight Terminators materialized simultaneously in a tight circular formation. They raised their glowing halberds, pointing the crackling energy blades directly at the towering form of the Daemon Primarch and his 12 bloodthirsters. The battle lines solidified as the heavily armored Daemon hunters braced themselves against the churned earth, their storm bolters aiming squarely at the chests of the advancing monsters. The heavy magnetic boots of the Grey Knights struck the churned mud of the River Styx. Silver armor gleamed under the crackling purple lightning of the warp storm overhead. The 109 Terminators raised their wrist-mounted storm bolters in unison, squeezing the activation triggers. Mass reactive shells poured into the advancing line of 12 bloodthirsters. Explosions tore through brass scales, splintered bone, and shredded thick leathery wings. The massive daemons charged through the concentrated fire, swinging their oversized battle axes and cracking their iron whips against the silver formation. Angron stepped forward through the center of his bodyguard. The massive red Daemon Primarch towered over the Terminators, his hooves sinking deep into the wet earth. He gripped his black iron sword with both hands and swung it in a wide horizontal arc. The blade sheared entirely through the torsos of 5 Grey Knights. Silver ceramite plating, human flesh, and reinforced bone separated instantly, spilling bright red blood and sparking internal circuitry onto the mud. The surviving Grey Knights closed the gap, stepping over the severed bodies of their brothers to thrust their crackling Nemesis Force halberds into the thick, muscular legs of the monster. The immense weight and ferocity of the Chaos forces flattened the Imperial center. Angron brought his hooves down, crushing the helmets of fallen Terminators deep into the soil. The bloodthirsters lashed their spiked iron whips, wrapping the cords around the necks of the defenders and pulling them directly into the spinning teeth of their axes. Silver armor dented, sparked, and tore open under the heavy blows. Angron raised his black blade high above his head, preparing to bring it down and cleave the remaining Daemon hunters into the ground. He stood with his chest heaving, raising his arms to roar his victory at the sky, stepping blindly over the smaller warriors, scrambling around his hooves. A young Grey Knight psyker named Hyperion stepped past the front line. He dropped his halberd into the mud and thrust both of his hands upward toward the descending black iron sword. Hyperion channeled raw psychic energy from his mind, projecting a concentrated kinetic barrier directly against the metal of the descending blade. Blood sprayed from Hyperion's nose and tear ducts as the physical strain ruptured the vessels within his skull. The psychic force slammed into the demonic iron. Fine cracks spread rapidly across the surface of the massive weapon. A second later, the sword shattered into thousands of jagged shards, raining down upon the mud and pinging off the armored shoulders of the combatants. Angron staggered backward, looking at the ruined hilt of his weapon. Taking advantage of the sudden opening, Brother Captain Terramar Aurelian, the commanding officer of the Grey Knights, charged directly at the unbalanced Daemon Primarch. Terramar channeled his own psychic power into his nemesis force halberd, creating a blinding blue corona of energy around the blade. He drove the halberd deep into Angron's chest, piercing the thick brass plating and sliding between the fused ribs. Angron grabbed Terramar in his massive red claws and squeezed. The silver Terminator armor crumpled inward under the extreme pressure, snapping Terramar's bones and crushing his internal organs. As Terramar's body broke, the psychic charge within his embedded halberd detonated inside the Daemon Primarch's chest cavity. A shockwave of pure white energy erupted from the point of impact. The blast incinerated Terramar's physical remains and tore Angron's demonic form apart from the inside out. The massive red body dissolved into swirling ash and burning embers, pulled violently backward through a sudden, localized tear in reality. The warp sucked the remains of the Daemon Primarch away, banishing him from the physical universe for exactly 101 years. Severed from the anchoring presence of their master, the 12 bloodthirsters and the lesser daemons lost their physical cohesion. Their bodies melted into pools of boiling blood and sulphurous smoke, evaporating completely into the humid jungle air. The surviving Chaos cultists and World Eaters watched the daemons vanish from the riverbank. They dropped their heavy weapons and fled north, running back toward the smoking hive cities of Armageddon Prime. The Space Wolves and the Steel Legion advanced over the ruined riverbanks, firing bolters and lasguns into the backs of the retreating horde. The surviving Grey Knights knelt in the mud, gathering the shattered silver armor pieces of their fallen brothers. The guns fell silent along the riverbank, leaving the surviving citizens staring at the glowing warp rifts and the melting demonic corpses. Factory workers and planetary defense soldiers stood among the wreckage, their eyes wide as they processed the sight of daemons tearing through reality and Chaos Space Marines butchering Imperial forces. High in the upper atmosphere, sleek black dropships bearing the stylized rosette of the Inquisition detached from their cruisers. They descended rapidly from orbit, deploying their containment teams directly into the populated hive centers to process the human populations who had survived the demonic incursion. Black-hulled ships, bearing the rosette of the Inquisition, settled onto the ferrocrete landing pads of Armageddon Secundus. Ramps lowered with the grinding of heavy hydraulic gears. Inquisitors in long leather coats strode down into the ash-choked air, flanked by rigidly marching stormtroopers carrying hellguns with glowing power cables. The battle for the planet had ended, and the remaining citizens and surviving planetary defense soldiers stood in the streets. They carried lasguns covered in the blood of cultists and wore uniforms torn by demonic claws. The people carried direct visual confirmation of the warp and the servants of Khorne in their minds, having watched rifts tear open the sky and brass-scaled monsters butcher their officers. The Inquisitors walked through the hive cities and inspected the massive manufactorums. Heavy machinery still stamped out Lehman Russ tank treads, and assembly lines pushed forward thousands of artillery shells every hour. The planet generated a staggering volume of military hardware for the Segmentum Solar. The Inquisitors looked at the output ledgers and determined the industrial capacity of Armageddon held too much physical value to subject the world to cyclonic torpedoes or atmospheric incineration. The Inquisition initiated a total planetary quarantine and a systematic purge of the population to protect the wider Imperium from the knowledge of chaos. Inquisitorial stormtroopers formed tight cordons around the surviving members of the Armageddon Steel Legion and the hive workers. They pointed their weapons at the exhausted veterans, ordered them to drop their lasguns, and marched them toward the yawning cargo bays of unmarked orbital transports. Inside the cold metal holds of the ships, heavy iron clamps snapped shut around the wrists and ankles of the survivors. Medical servitors with surgical drills and injection needles grafted to their limbs rolled down the narrow aisles. The servitors drove long needles into the arms and necks of the guardsmen and hive workers, pumping thick chemical sterilants directly into their bloodstreams. The fluids burned through their veins, permanently stripping every man and woman of the physical ability to reproduce. The transport ships carried the sterilized populations away from the main hive clusters and deposited them into isolated labor camps, constructed deep within the ash wastes. High walls of sheer ferrocrete, topped with thick coils of razor wire and automated heavy bolter turrets, boxed in the prisoners. The air inside the camps smelled of raw sulfur and unwashed bodies. The survivors spent their remaining days digging drainage trenches and breaking rocks with heavy iron picks. They wore grey penal uniforms and collapsed from physical exhaustion and the lingering effects of the chemical injections, dying slowly in the grey dirt far from the cities they had just bled to save. Back in the hives, the Inquisition executed a meticulous erasure of the war. Armed guards stood over the scribes in the planetary archives, watching as the clerks shoveled thousands of parchment scrolls and service records into roaring incinerators. Orange flames curled the thick vellum and reduced the histories to black ash. Tech priests connected thick data spikes to the main cogitator banks, wiping the hard drives completely clean of any digital recording, pict capture, or transmission mentioning Angron, the World Eaters, or the silver-armored Grey Knights. Servitors scrubbed the organic residue from the factory floors with heavy rotary brushes and industrial bleach, leaving a sharp chemical stench in the air. To replace the millions lost in the invasion and the subsequent purges, the Inquisition redirected massive bulk freighters from neighboring systems. Billions of new workers stepped off the transport ships and walked directly into the empty hab blocks. They took their positions at the assembly lines, pulling the levers and stamping the metal plates, completely devoid of any knowledge regarding the warp lightning that had scarred the sky just months prior. They drank the recycled water and breathed the heavy smog, entirely disconnected from the slaughtered populations who had previously stood in those exact spots. The black ships continued their systematic operations, sending stormtroopers out to round up the last pockets of survivors hiding in the equatorial jungle and the ruined sectors of Armageddon Prime. From the elevated ridges of the surviving Imperial bunkers, the Space Wolves watched the entire process unfold. The grey-armoured warriors gripped the leather hafts of their frost axes as they looked down at the transport lines. They saw the stormtroopers clamping iron shackles onto the wrists of the very guardsmen they had fought alongside in the mud of the River Styx. The Space Wolves bared their elongated canine teeth, their ceramite power armor growling as they shifted their weight, and they fixed their glowing golden eyes directly on the Inquisitors, coordinating the purge below. The grey-armored Space Wolves marched down the ferrocrete ramps of the staging bunkers, stepping directly into the path of the inquisitorial containment teams. They planted their heavy boots on the landing pads and raised their storm bolters, pointing the wide barrels at the black-armored stormtroopers. The Space Wolves reached into the lines of prisoners, gripping the thick iron chains binding the men and women, and snapped the metal links with their ceramite-encased hands. They pulled the exhausted, mud-covered veterans behind their armored bulk, physically shielding the survivors from the surgical servitors. Inquisitors in long leather coats drew their power swords, activating the energy fields that crackled along the steel edges. Stormtroopers raised their hell guns, aiming the laser sights at the chest plates of the towering Space Marines. Bright red laser blasts struck the grey ceramite, scorching the paint and leaving blackened craters in the armor. The Space Wolves retaliated immediately. Mass reactive bolter shells tore through the black carapace armor of the stormtroopers, detonating inside their chests and spreading blood and bone fragments across the landing pad grates. Frostblades severed limbs and shattered helmets, dropping the Inquisition enforcers to the ground. The conflict spread from the surface into the upper atmosphere, as the Space Wolf strike cruisers rotated their massive macro cannons and locked their targeting lasers directly onto the black-hulled Inquisition vessels. The Void War manifested in localized boarding actions and orbital blockades. Space Wolf ships escorted civilian transports out of the Armageddon system, taking thousands of rescued citizens back toward the icy terrain of Fenris. Behind them, the Inquisition black ships fired cyclonic torpedoes at the escaping vessels, blowing civilian freighters into burning clouds of expanding plasma and twisted metal. The Space Wolves returned fire, ripping holes in the Inquisition cruisers with concentrated lance strikes. On the surface of Armageddon, the remaining guardsmen and factory workers marched into the ash-waste labor camps. They swung their heavy iron picks into the grey rock, coughing blood from the chemical sterilants, and collapsed onto the dry dirt to die beneath the scorching sun. The physical scars of this bloodshed dictated the interactions between the Space Wolves and the Inquisition. For the next 5 centuries, Space Wolf captains severed all physical Vox connections when Inquisition ships entered the same orbital space. When the two factions occupied the same planetary war zones, the Space Marines kept their hands gripped tightly around the hilts of their axes, while Inquisitors stood behind thick lines of heavily armed bodyguards. The grey-armored warriors steered their vessels away from Inquisition-controlled orbital stations, and they carved deep warning runes into their ship bulkheads to record the actions taken during the Armageddon campaign. The smell of burning civilian transports and the sight of shackled guardsmen remained locked in the eidetic memories of the chapter. On Armageddon, 500 years of real-time ground forward. Construction servitors poured millions of tons of fresh ferrocrete over the ruins of the hive cities, building new spires higher into the smog-choked clouds. Generations of factory workers turned the giant iron cranks of the manufactorums, breathing the recycled air and stamping out new lines of armored vehicles. The ash storms blew across the equatorial jungle, burying the shattered bones of demons and the rusted tracks of destroyed tanks deep beneath the grey dirt. The chroncogitators on the orbital defense platforms rolled forward to the year 941 of the 41st millennium. Deep in the void beyond the Armageddon system, a massive fleet of crude, rust-covered spaceships entered the sector. These vessels consisted of hollowed-out asteroids and welded scrap metal, trailing thick black exhaust from unshielded engines. Inside the holds of these crude ships, millions of massive Xenos warriors with thick green skin, heavy tusks, and bloodshot eyes sharpened their iron choppers on grinding wheels. They bellowed deep, guttural roars, pacing the grated decks and waiting to spill fresh blood on the rebuilt hive world. The orbital cogitator banks of Armageddon rolled their copper dials forward, locking the date to the year 941 of the 41st millennium. Deep in the void beyond the segmentum solar, millions of crude, rust-covered spaceships moved through the darkness. These vessels consisted of hollowed-out asteroids and welded scrap metal, trailing thick black exhaust from exposed engine cores. Inside the holds of these ships stood the orcs. These Xenos possessed massive frames, thick green skin, and heavy lower jaws jutting with yellowed tusks. They carried crude iron choppers and heavy ballistic firearms built from salvaged pipes and loose cogs. The orcs engaged in constant physical violence, headbutting each other and swinging their heavy boots into the ribs of their clanmates to establish dominance in the cramped corridors. Smaller, scrawny greenskins known as Gretchen scurried between the heavy boots of the larger warriors, carrying buckets of greasy ammunition and dodging the heavy metal kicks. The biology of the greenskins forced their bodies to grow larger and their muscles to become denser with every physical altercation they survived. They gathered in the massive cargo bays to shout the names of their twin deities, Gork and Mork. Mech boys, the orc engineers, constructed towering effigies of these gods using melted tank treads, rusted engine blocks, and the skulls of conquered enemies. The greenskins pounded their heavy iron choppers against the metal deck plates and unleashed deafening roars, generating a collective psychic energy field. This raw energy pulsed through the fleet, causing the exposed plasma drives of their scrap ships to burn hotter and pushing the armada faster through the void. The smell of burning promethium, raw sweat, and alien fungus filled the ventilation shafts of the entire fleet. At the center of this armada stood the largest orc in the fleet, the warlord Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka. Gazkul towered over the other war bosses, his chest wide enough to block a standard transport corridor. A thick plate of riveted adamantium covered the upper right half of his skull, bolted directly into his green flesh. A mechanical red eye glowed from the metal casing, whirring and clicking as it scanned the lesser orcs around him. He wore heavy mega armor, constructed from looted Imperial tank plating, painted in black and yellow hazard stripes, and heavily chipped by physical impacts. A massive power claw snapped open and shut on his left arm, the hydraulic pistons hissing with pressurized fluid. On his right arm, he wielded a custom-built, multi-barreled rotary gun capable of tearing through ferrocrete bunkers. Gazkul frequently grabbed subordinate war bosses by the throat and crushed their windpipes to maintain absolute physical control over the armada, forcing thousands of rival orc clans to direct their aggression strictly toward the incoming Imperial world. Gazkul walked to the primary view screen on the bridge of his flagship, a massive floating fortress built around the gutted chassis of an Imperial cruiser. He stared at the star map projected in glowing green lumen lights across the display glass. He raised his massive power claw and slammed the adamantium blades directly into the geographical projection of the Armageddon system, cracking the glass and sending electrical sparks cascading over the control console. Gazkul directed his fleet toward the Hive world, specifically to engage the billions of Imperial soldiers stationed there. He required the massive industrial centers and the high concentration of armored vehicles produced by the planet to supply his forces with a sustained, physically devastating conflict. The Greenskin Armada pushed closer to the Armageddon system, blocking out the light of distant stars with the sheer mass of their scrap ships. Asteroid fortresses fitted with massive forward-facing macro cannons rotated their thrusters, aligning their trajectories with the Ash world. Inside the ships, millions of orcs loaded oversized brass shells into their weapons and strapped heavy iron plates to their chests. Warning sirens and proximity alarms triggered across the outer orbital defense platforms of Armageddon, flashing bright red lumen strips into the eyes of the stationed sentries. The automated auger arrays printed out miles of parchment paper, detailing the approaching mass of the Xenos fleet. Scribes tore the heavy paper from the brass rolling pins and sprinted down the marble transit corridors of the command spires. Their boots clattered loudly against the polished stone as they rushed past the armored guards standing at attention. They carried the heavily inked scrolls detailing the massive Xenos threat directly to the mahogany desk of the planetary governor, who currently held absolute command over the world's defenses. Overlord Hermann von Straub sat behind the massive mahogany desk in his spire command center. He wore a high-collared jacket woven from crimson synth velvet, and heavy gold rings constricted his thick fingers. He chewed on strips of roasted grox meat and wiped the grease from his chin with a silk cloth. The scribes laid the miles of printed auger parchment across the polished wood of his desk. Von Straub scanned the black ink, detailing the millions of incoming biosignatures and the massive metallic mass of the Xenos fleet. He crumpled the parchment into a tight ball and tossed it onto the marble floor. He raised his hand, gesturing for his cyber cherub attendants to pour more amasec into his golden goblet. He kept his eyes on his drink, explicitly instructing his military advisors to stand down. The tactical advisors leaned over the glowing green lumen screens, pointing at the cluster of incoming contacts. They presented defense readiness reports and orbital battery ammunition reserves. Von Straub waved his heavily ringed hand, interrupting their physical assessments. He ordered the astropathic choir to remain entirely silent. He explicitly forbade any transmission to Segmentum Command or the Adeptus Terra. He wanted the absolute military glory of repelling the invasion to rest solely on his shoulders. He declared that the Armageddon Planetary Defense Force possessed enough Lehman-Russ demolisher tanks and heavy macro cannons to blast the rusted scrap ships out of the sky before they ever breached the lower atmosphere. He pushed his chair back, stood up, and commanded the scribes to leave his chambers so he could finish his meal. Commissar Sebastian Yarrick walked through the heavy brass doors of the command center. Yarrick wore a long black storm coat and a peaked cap pulled low over his heavily scarred forehead. A standard-issue bolt pistol rested in the leather holster at his hip. Yarrick picked up the crumpled ball of parchment from the floor, smoothed out the creases, and read the auger data. He stepped directly to the edge of the mahogany desk and slammed his fist onto the polished wood. He pointed his gloved finger at the sheer scale of the sensor ghost. The data indicated thousands of massive crewed vessels and millions of heavy alien biosignatures moving on a direct intercept course with Armageddon Prime. Yarrick demanded immediate general mobilization and the instant dispatch of distress signals to the surrounding star systems. Von Straub stood up from his chair, his face flushing dark red. He pointed a trembling finger at the door and shouted commands for the commissar to exit the spire immediately. Yarrick turned on his heel, his heavy boots clicking sharply against the marble floor. He walked past the uniformed spire guards and marched directly into the primary astropathic choir chambers. The room smelled of burning incense and ozone. Yarrick stood over the seated, blind astropaths and unholstered his bolt pistol. He ordered the choir to open their minds to the immaterium and project a general distress signal into the warp. The astropaths gripped the armrests of their copper chairs, blood dripping from their nostrils and tear ducts as they pushed the telepathic scream outward toward the naval patrols and space marine strike cruisers stationed in the neighboring sectors. Enforcers rushed into the spire dining hall and delivered the report of the unauthorized transmission directly to the planetary governor. Von Straub smashed his golden goblet against the edge of the mahogany desk, denting the soft metal and spilling the amber liquid across the wood. He grabbed a blank sheet of vellum and a heavy autoquill. He rapidly drafted a physical reassignment order, pressing his personalized brass signet ring into a puddle of hot red wax to seal the document. He stripped Yarrick of his central command access and ordered him banished to Hades' Hive, a suffocating industrial center located deep within Armageddon Secundus. Armed guards escorted Yarrick down through the hive levels and placed him onto a heavy armored crawler bound for the ash wastes. The transport ramp slammed shut, and the tracks churned the grey dirt as the vehicle moved away from the capital. Yarrick stood in the rattling passenger hold, checking the ammunition load in his bolt pistol and sharpening the edge of his combat knife. High above the traveling crawler, the red warning lights on the planetary auger arrays spun rapidly. The green blips on the orbital tracking monitors merged completely with the planet's atmospheric boundary line, as the massive scrap fleet plunged directly toward the western continent. The Orc fleet breached the upper atmosphere of Armageddon in the year 941 of the 41st millennium. Heavy scrap ships slammed into the grey clouds, tearing through the smog and deploying millions of crude drop pods across the western continent of Armageddon Prime. The iron pods struck the ferrocrete transit routes and ash waste plains, cracking the ground and sending plumes of grey dust into the air. The heavy metal ramps blew outward with loud explosive charges. Millions of massive greenskins charged out of the craters, raising crude iron axes and firing large-caliber ballistic weapons into the surrounding industrial sectors. Inside the capital spire of Armageddon Secundus, Planetary Governor Hermann von Straub directed the military response from his mahogany desk. He moved small metal markers across a physical parchment map, deploying the Armageddon Planetary Defense Force in isolated, staggered formations. He ordered single armored columns of Lehman Russ tanks to roll out onto the ash plains far ahead of their supporting infantry. He commanded small companies of guardsmen to march into the open wastes hundreds of miles beyond their supply lines. His tactical advisors pointed at the massive sensor ghosts on the lumen displays, presenting printed reports of the overwhelming enemy numbers, and von Straub simply waved his ringed hands and dismissed the officers from the room. The Orc hordes immediately overwhelmed these fractured Imperial units. War bosses drove heavy tracked battle wagons covered in spiked metal plates directly into the sides of the isolated Lehman Russ tanks. The impact flipped the Imperial armor into the dirt, exposing the vulnerable undercarriages to the heavy rotary saws of the Xenos engineers. Millions of green-skinned warriors surrounded the stranded infantry companies. The greenskins swung heavy iron choppers, severing the limbs of the guardsmen and slicing through their green flak armor. They fired sluggers at close range, blowing large holes in the chests of the defenders. Within hours, the ash wastes were covered in burning Imperial vehicles and the mangled corpses of the planetary defense regiments. The greenskins pushed rapidly across the entire landmass of Armageddon Prime. They tore down the outer ferrocrete walls of the primary hab centers, swarming through the manufacturing districts and slaughtering the factory workers at their assembly lines. The surviving PDF units retreated in a full rout, leaving their heavy macro cannons and overflowing ammunition depots to the scavengers. The Orcs looted the weapons, welding Imperial heavy bolters to their own crude vehicles, and claimed the entire western continent. The alien horde then turned its attention toward the coastal industrial hub of Port Hellsreach. To shield their advance from the high-yield macro cannons mounted on the city walls, the Orc psychers, known as Weird Boys, gathered on the ash plains. These psychers convulsed violently, gripping heavy copper staves as their eyes glowed with bright green energy. They channeled the raw aggression of the surrounding horde, their muscles bulging under the physical strain of the warp power. The weird boys opened their mouths and projected massive arcs of green lightning directly into the sky. The lightning formed a thick, swirling psychic storm that blanketed the coastal city, plunging the defenders into darkness and disrupting their targeting augurs. Under the cover of the green clouds, the orcs scaled the outer walls of Port Hellsreach. They ripped the heavy bolter emplacements from their metal mounts and slaughtered the entire garrison, throwing the bodies of the Imperial defenders from the high walls into the churning ocean below. With Armageddon Prime secured, the Orc Armada pushed south and east into Armageddon Secundus. Greenskin transport barges crossed the heavy waters of the equatorial ocean, their engines churning the water into a thick white foam. Motorized warbands drove heavily modified ash buggies through the dense jungle paths, snapping the thick green vines and crushing the flora beneath oversized tires. Imperial delay elements set up barricades of felled trees and deployed anti-tank mines along the muddy riverbanks. The orcs drove their heavy battle wagons directly over the explosives. The blasts destroyed the leading vehicles, sending burning metal and green bodies high into the air, and the subsequent waves of orcs simply drove over the flaming wreckage to crush the Imperial sappers into the river mud. The massive green tide spilled out of the jungle and onto the grey plains of Armageddon Secundus. Millions of orcs marched in a continuous column stretching back to the horizon, kicking up a dust cloud that darkened the sun. The horde split into two primary spearheads, moving with singular focus toward the two largest industrial targets in the sector. One massive column of tanks and infantry aimed its weapons at the towering metal spires of Hive Acheron. The other spearhead, led by the massive armored frame of Ghazghkull himself, marched directly toward the heavily fortified blast doors of Hades' Hive, where a recently banished commissar currently stood on the outer walls organizing the local defense forces. Hades' Hive sat near the center of Armageddon Secundus, a massive vertical sprawl of heavy industry and tightly packed hab blocks. The towering spire cast long shadows over the surrounding ash wastes. Inside the city, millions of Hive workers abandoned the manufactorum assembly lines and crowded into the transit arteries. Commissar Yarrick stood on the Ferrocrete command balcony overlooking the primary defense grid. He wore his black storm coat and stared directly down the access corridors as local enforcers and the surviving PDF regiments established a heavy defensive perimeter. Workers tore heavy iron plates from the factory floors and welded them over the massive transit gates, barricading the lower levels with rusted scrap metal and overturned transport haulers. The orc horde reached the outer edge of Hades' Hive. The ground shook continuously as millions of heavy boots stomped the grey dirt. Towering, mechanical orc gargants rolled forward on wide iron treads, their belly-mounted macro cannons pointing directly at the hive walls. Ghazghkull watched the defense preparations from his heavily armored battle wagon. The war boss commanded his artillery crews to open fire, sending massive brass-cased explosive shells arching over the ash plains. The shells slammed into the upper levels of the hive city, shattering the thick plasteel windows and collapsing the outer hab blocks. Inside the hive, Yarrick remained entirely still on the command balcony. He spoke into the master voxcaster, issuing direct orders for the Imperial heavy bolter teams and Lascanon crews to hold their fire until the greenskins reached the base of the primary walls. The orcs charged the barricades, screaming loudly and swinging their heavy axes. Fire flashed from the Imperial bunkers, tearing through the green skin of the front ranks. The orcs ignored the casualties and climbed over the growing piles of their dead to hack at the welded iron plates. As the ground assault battered against the lower gates, Ghazghkull deployed his elite commandos. These specialized greenskins painted their skin with dark gray ash and black oil. They loaded onto crude dropships that flew high over the battlefield, bypassing the lower defenses entirely, and jumped directly onto the high spires of the hive. The commandos carried silenced sluggers and combat knives, moving quietly through the upper ventilation shafts with the intent to sabotage the Imperial command structure. Yarrick anticipated the vertical flanking maneuver. He ordered squads of tunnel fighters and maintenance engineers into the ventilation network. These men wore tight, grease-stained overalls and carried short combat blades and stub-nosed auto-pistols. They crawled into the narrow, dark metal shafts, moving silently through the cramped spaces. When the orc commandos dropped into the vents, the tunnel fighters engaged them in extreme close-quarters combat. The humans slid their short blades under the chins of the larger greenskins, slicing their throats in the darkness and firing point-blank bursts into their chests. Within an hour, the engineers cleared the entire upper ventilation network, leaving the dead commandos wedged tightly in the metal ducts. Ghazghkull paced the deck of his command wagon, enraged by the failure of his infiltration forces. He ordered the massive gargants to move closer and bombard the main gate. The huge mechanical idols opened fire, continuously blasting the welded iron barricades until the metal warped and buckled inward. Yarrick watched the heavy guns tear apart the primary defenses. He organized small, fast-moving suicide squads composed of the most desperate penal legionnaires and volunteers from the local gangs. These squads strapped heavy melter charges to their chests and sprinted out of the side access ports, darting through the craters and ash. They climbed directly onto the tracks of the orc gargants and detonated the explosives manually, vaporizing their own bodies and melting the drive chains of the towering machines. The constant strategic counters from the Imperial defenders infuriated the orc warlord. Every brute force assault met a perfectly timed ambush. Every flanking maneuver met prepared barricades. Ghazghkull abandoned his command wagon and stepped directly onto the ash plains. He raised his massive power claw and fired his multi-barreled rotary gun into the air, signaling the entirety of his immediate retinue to follow him. He turned his attention solely to Hades' hive, completely ignoring the strategic reports from the other fronts across Armageddon Secundus. He wanted to physically crush the single human commander who had successfully stalled the largest greenskin invasion the planet had ever seen. He charged directly toward the shattered main gates of the hive, determined to rip the black-coated commissar apart with his own hands. Ghazghkull halted his advance just outside the firing arc of the Imperial macro cannons. He turned to one of his largest subordinate war bosses, a massive brute with thick iron plates bolted directly to his collarbones, and physically pushed him toward the breached gates of Hades' hive. The war boss carried a spinning power claw that vented blue plasma exhaust and led a vanguard of heavily armored orc knobs over the crushed ferrocrete barricades. They stepped directly over the bodies of the Imperial tunnel fighters, crushing skulls under heavy metal boots. Commissar Yarrick stood at the center of the breach, holding his standard-issue bolt pistol and a buzzing chainsword. He directed the volley of fire from the surviving planetary defense forces directly into the advancing greenskins. The war boss spotted the black-coated commissar and charged through the crossfire, swinging his heavy power claw directly at Yarrick's chest. Yarrick dodged the first swing, rolling across the grated floor and firing mass-reactive bolts into the thick green skin of the warboss's torso. The explosive rounds blew chunks of muscle and black blood onto the surrounding walls. The orc ignored the deep wounds and swung his power claw in a wide horizontal arc. The heavy metal blades caught Yarrick's right arm, severing it cleanly above the elbow. Blood pumped rapidly from the stump, coating the side of the commissar's black stormcoat and spilling onto the metal floor. Yarrick fell to his knees, gripping the bleeding stump tightly with his left hand. The warboss stood over him, raising his power claw to crush the commissar's head. Yarrick reached into his coat with his remaining hand, pulled a localized explosive charge, and shoved it directly into the open, roaring mouth of the greenskin. The detonation blew the top half of the warboss's head off, sending the massive green corpse crashing onto the ferrocrete. Combat medics dragged Yarrick away from the breach and threw him onto a metal surgical table inside a field hospital. The room smelled of sharp antiseptics and raw copper. Medical servitors attached thick iron clamps to his limbs to hold him steady. Yarrick ordered the tech priests to drag the corpse of the orc warboss into the surgical bay. He pointed his left hand at the dead greenskin's power claw and commanded the surgeons to graft the heavy alien weapon directly to his severed stump. The tech priests used heavy plasma cutters to sever the mechanical claw, fusing the crude iron joints and pneumatic pistons to Yarrick's exposed bone and nervous system. During the lengthy procedure, stray shrapnel from an incoming artillery shell shattered the glass of the medical bay window and sliced horizontally across Yarrick's face, destroying his left eye. He instructed the medics to implant a heavy bionic optic unit into the ruined socket. The implant emitted a highly visible, continuous red laser beam from the mechanical lens. Yarrick returned to the front lines just hours later, dragging the heavy iron power claw across the ferrocrete and scanning the smoke with his glowing red eye. The greenskins watched the black-coated human lift the claw of their dead warboss and snap the hydraulic pincers. They saw the red laser cutting through the thick smog. The orcs pointed at the laser and exchanged guttural words about physical curses, staring at the mechanical lens and backing away from the barricades. They spread rumors across the horde that the human commander possessed an evil eye capable of killing with a single glance. Greenskins dropped their choppers and abandoned their assault on that specific gate, unwilling to cross the path of the red beam. Guardsmen slumped against the ferrocrete walls, dropping empty power packs onto the ground and staring blankly at their own blood-covered hands. Rations consisted of recycled nutrient paste, and the municipal water scrubbers pumped out brown, sulfur-tasting sludge. Soldiers chewed on the leather straps of their lasguns, and their hands trembled continuously under the non-stop bombardment from the orc gargants. Yarrick marched up and down the defense lines, lifting exhausted soldiers by their collars, using the hydraulic strength of his new power claw. He pointed his red optical laser directly into their faces, shouting execution orders and forcing them to pick up their lasguns. The men and women of Hades' hive stood up, fixing their bayonets and aiming their weapons back at the breaches, driven entirely by the physical presence and sheer brutality of the commissar. The continuous thud of orc artillery battered the exterior of the hive for weeks, cracking the primary support pillars and collapsing entire hab blocks into grey dust. The defenders ran completely out of medical supplies, using ripped uniforms to bind deep lacerations. The green tide pushed closer, trapping the remaining humans in the uppermost levels of the spire. Yarrick and his surviving forces stood in a tight circle around the central command bunker, surrounded by mountains of dead greenskins and emptied ammunition crates. High above the heavy atmospheric smog, The heat signatures of heavily armored drop pods flared across the orbital auger screens, descending rapidly from the void toward the exact coordinates of the Orc command camp. The drop pods slammed into the ash-covered plains directly behind the Orc lines, kicking up thick clouds of grey dust. Heavy ceramite ramps blew open, and the Blood Angels charged out into the smog. They wore bright crimson power armor, heavily adorned with gold trim and purity seals. Commander Dante, chapter master of the Blood Angels, led the assault. He wore a finely crafted golden death mask that entirely obscured his facial features, and he carried a heavy axe that crackled with blue energy. He fired the primary thrusters of his jump pack, launching himself high into the air and dropping directly into the center of the Orc command camp. The Blood Angels followed his lead, firing rapid bursts from their bolters and swinging heavy chainswords into the surprised greenskins. The Space Marines targeted the massive gargants and heavy battle wagons parked around the camp. Devastator squads braced heavy las cannons against the cracked earth, firing highly concentrated beams of thermal energy directly into the exposed plasma engines of the Orc machines. The tanks detonated violently, sending flaming metal plates tearing through the surrounding Orc infantry. Assault Marines activated their jump packs, landing heavily on the metal roofs of the crude fortifications. They drove their chainswords directly through the corrugated iron, cutting through the Orc engineers and communication equipment below. The sudden, overwhelming firepower of the Space Marines completely paralyzed the local command structure of the Orc horde. Dante advanced through the center of the camp, swinging his crackling axe to sever the heads and limbs of any greenskin that stepped into his path. He searched specifically for the massive armored form of Gazkul. Dante intended to physically execute the Orc warlord, severing the absolute control Gazkul held over the millions of greenskins currently besieging the planet. However, Gazkul was entirely absent from the command camp. Hours prior to the orbital drop, the warlord had driven his battle wagon to the front lines to personally oversee the ongoing assault on Hades' hive. Dante's axe cleaved through the remaining Orc knobs, but he found only heavily modified subordinate warbosses attempting to direct the chaotic defense. While the Blood Angels dismantled the Orc command structure, additional Space Marine strike cruisers arrived in orbit above Armageddon. Heavy dropships painted in bright blue and deep green breached the atmosphere. The Ultramarines deployed armored columns of Predator executioner tanks directly onto the ash plains, laying down overlapping fields of macro cannon fire to push back the advancing green tide. The salamanders dropped into the narrow transit corridors near the surviving hive cities. They wore heavy green power armor and carried thick iron flamers, unleashing torrents of burning promethium into the tightly packed crowds of charging Orcs. The sheer physical presence of 3 distinct Space Marine chapters halted the greenskin momentum across the entire continent. The localized destruction of the Orc command camp severely disrupted the supply lines feeding the siege of Hades' hive. The massive gargants surrounding the city ran out of heavy explosive shells, forcing the artillery crews to load rocks and scrap metal into the macro cannons. Millions of Orc infantrymen completely exhausted their ammunition reserves. The greenskins dropped their empty sluggers and resorted to using crude iron axes and their bare hands to bash against the ferrocrete barricades. The continuous flow of food and promethium completely stopped, forcing the physically exhausted Orcs to slaughter and consume the smaller Gretchen just to maintain their dense muscle mass. Inside Hades' hive, the defenders seized the opportunity. Yarick ordered the surviving PDF units to push out of the central command bunker. The guardsmen advanced over the mountains of dead greenskins, firing their remaining laspaks into the disorganized orc ranks. Yarrick marched at the front of the line, his black storm coat heavily stained with blood and oil. He raised his grafted orc power claw and crushed the skull of a charging greenskin, while his bionic eye scanned the ash plains for the massive form of the enemy warlord. The combined Imperial counteroffensive physically broke the siege, pushing the starving and disorganized orcs back across the broken ferrocrete and out into the open ash wastes. The massive greenskin horde fractured under the strain of empty supply lines. Orcs pulled the triggers of their heavy sluggers, producing only hollow metallic clicks as the firing chambers cycled without brass shells. Mech boys tore the engine blocks out of stalled battle wagons, using heavy wrenches and plasma cutters to forge crude melee weapons from the scrap metal. Without the constant influx of fungal food vats, the larger orcs grabbed the smaller Gretchen by their thin limbs and tore them apart with their bare teeth, swallowing the green flesh raw to sustain their dense muscle mass. Rival clan bosses swung their iron choppers at each other's throats, fighting over the few remaining fuel canisters and scrap piles scattered across the dirt. Commander Dante directed the Imperial counteroffensive across the ash plains of Armageddon Secundus. Blood angels in crimson ceramite marched alongside ultramarines in cobalt blue, firing disciplined, overlapping volleys of mass-reactive bolts into the fractured orc mobs. The Space Marines advanced methodically through the ruined hab blocks of Hive Tartarus. Salamanders aimed their heavy flamers into the dark transit corridors, burning the entrenched greenskins to ash and clearing the lower levels layer by layer. Imperial Lehman Russ tanks rolled over the remains of destroyed orc gargants, their heavy treads crushing the rusted iron plates deep into the grey dirt. The combined military force pushed the green tide back mile by mile, reclaiming the shattered ferrocrete foundations of the industrial sectors and securing the main water purification plants. Razkul Mag Uruk Thraka stood on the cracked plains outside Hades' hive and watched his vanguard collapse under the concentrated Space Marine artillery fire. The warlord crushed the skull of a fleeing Nob beneath his heavy adamantium boot. He registered the depleted ammunition reserves and the lack of incoming dropships from the upper atmosphere. Gazkul signaled a general retreat, raising his multi-barreled rotary gun and firing a long burst into the air to direct his surviving clan leaders back to the landing zones. The massive warboss boarded a heavy transport lander, the thrusters burning the ground as the ship lifted into the smog-choked sky. Millions of surviving greenskins scrambled up the boarding ramps of their crewed vessels, abandoning the planetary surface and leaving behind thousands of burning tanks. While the Space Marines secured the primary transit hubs, the high-security detention cells beneath the capital spire broke open. Guards assigned to watch the former planetary governor, Hermann von Straub, lay dead on the marble floors with their throats slit and their autoguns stripped of power packs. The heavy iron door of the cell hung loosely on its hinges, the electronic locking mechanism completely short-circuited by a plasma torch. Von Straub abandoned his crimson velvet coat, wrapping himself in the heavy grey canvas of a transit worker. He slipped through the lower maintenance tunnels, bypassing the Imperial cordons and walking out into the open ash wastes, vanishing completely from the physical surveillance grids of the local enforcers. Commissar Sebastian Yarrick stood on the ferrocrete balcony of Hades' hive, looking out over the ash plains. He drove his heavy orc power claw into the ferrocrete rail, the jagged metal scraping against the stone. His black stormcoat hung in torn strips, saturated with dried alien blood and gun oil. His bionic eye projected a sharp red beam into the settling dust, tracking the plasma trails of the fleeing Orc scrap ships as they breached the upper cloud layer. Yarrick watched the alien fleet break orbit, gripping the handle of his bolt pistol tightly. He analyzed the sheer physical number of escaping vessels and calculated the warlord possessed enough surviving ships and manpower to return. High above the Segmentum Solar, Ghazghkull stood on the bridge of his orbiting flagship. He looked through the cracked armor-glass viewport at the grey and brown sphere of Armageddon, receding into the dark void. He catalogued the structural weaknesses of the Hive cities, the exact deployment patterns of the Space Marines, and the specific combat tactics of the black-coated commissar. He turned his mechanical red eye away from the planet, recording the planetary conflict in his mind as a preliminary physical test of his armada. He ordered his fleet back into the warp, driving his ships deep into the immaterium to gather a new, exponentially larger horde for a second invasion of the heavily fortified Ash world. The decades following the Second War transformed Armageddon into the most heavily fortified planet in the Segmentum Solar. Imperial engineers poured thousands of tons of rockcrete to reinforce the shattered walls of the Hive cities. Tech priests installed overlapping arrays of macro cannons and void shield generators along the upper spires. In the ash wastes, construction servitors dug deep trenches lined with ceramite and set miles of razor wire across the plains. The Armageddon Steel Legion expanded their recruitment quotas, outfitting millions of new guardsmen with mustard-yellow trench coats and respirators. Factories produced Lehman Russ demolisher tanks around the clock, packing the munition depots with high-explosive shells. The Departamento Munitorum ordered a massive increase in orbital defenses. Massive defense platforms, studded with heavy lance batteries and torpedo tubes, drifted into high orbit above Armageddon Prime and Armageddon Secundus. The Imperial Navy stationed entire fleets of Gothic-class cruisers and Cobra destroyers in the surrounding system, maintaining constant patrols along the warp translation points. Astropaths remained physically wired into their copper chairs, scanning the immaterium for the psychic disturbances caused by Orc void engines. The Imperium directed these massive military resources specifically because Sebastian Yarrick, now bearing the title of Lord Commissar, physically refused to let the High Lords of Terror ignore his warnings. Yarrick did not stay on Armageddon to oversee the preparations. He boarded a strike cruiser and traveled across the sector, tracking rumors of massive Orc gatherings. His bionic red eye scanned tactical displays on dozens of worlds, searching for the specific yellow and black hazard stripes of Ghazghkull's armor. He interrogated captured Orc freebooters, crushing their thick fingers with his power claw until they revealed the coordinates of Greenskin staging grounds. The Commissar learned that Ghazghkull had not simply retreated. The warlord was actively uniting hundreds of disparate Orc empires under a single banner, preparing a WAG of unprecedented scale. Yarrick transmitted his findings directly to the Adeptus Terra, detailing the sheer volume of Orc scrap ships massing in the Golgotha sector. The High Lords reviewed the physical evidence and authorized the deployment of additional Space Marine chapters to the Armageddon system. Strike cruisers bearing the heraldry of the Black Templars, the Salamanders, and the White Scars arrived in orbit. The Space Marines established their own command bunkers within the Hive cities, locking their bolters and readying their drop pods. Yarrick returned to Armageddon, stepping off his transport ship in a heavy black stormcoat. He walked the newly reinforced walls of Hades' Hive, inspecting the macro cannons and the physical readiness of the Steel Legion guardsmen. In the year 998 of the 41st millennium, 57 years after his initial defeat, Ghazkul Mag Uruk Thraka returned. The orbital auger arrays of Armageddon flared bright red as the massive Orc Armada dropped out of the warp. The Greenskin fleet dwarfed the Armada of the Second War, filling the void with thousands of space hulks, asteroid fortresses, and salvaged Imperial battleships. The sheer mass of the Orc vessels physically pushed the Imperial Navy patrols out of formation. The Greenskin ships fired heavy plasma batteries and solid slug cannons, tearing through the armor plating of the Imperial cruisers. Burning debris from the destroyed void ships rained down onto the upper atmosphere of Armageddon, streaking across the sky like burning iron meteors. The orbital defense platforms opened fire, launching salvos of cyclonic torpedoes into the dense Orc formations. The explosions shattered dozens of scrap ships, but the green tide continued to push forward. Ghazkul stood on the bridge of his flagship, surrounded by thousands of Orc nobs. The warlord's mechanical red eye locked onto the geographical coordinates of Hades' hive. He gripped his multi-barreled rotary gun, raised his adamantium power claw, and ordered his fleet to commence the planetary bombardment. Heavy asteroids, fitted with massive thrusters, detached from the main fleet and plummeted toward the surface. The rocks struck the ash wastes and the outer hive walls with the physical force of tectonic quakes, throwing millions of tons of dirt and shattered rockcrete high into the air. The third war for Armageddon had officially begun, and Yarrick stood on the walls, watching the sky turn black with falling iron. The rocks struck Armageddon Prime and Armageddon Secundus. The kinetic impact of the massive asteroids cracked the planetary crust, triggering deep tectonic shifts. Lava erupted from the fault lines, spilling superheated magma across the ash wastes. The shockwaves traveled through the ferrocrete foundations of Hive Infernus and Hive Acheron, shattering the lower hablocks and sending millions of tons of steel and stone crashing down into the underhives. The debris clouds blocked out the sun entirely, plunging the planet into a thick, choking darkness. The surviving orbital defense platforms fired their lance batteries blindly into the dust clouds, trying to hit the massive green vessels dropping into the atmosphere. The Orc Armada completely bypassed the conventional transit routes. Ghazkul deployed specialized dropships known as rocks, hollowed-out meteors fitted with heavy plasma thrusters, directly onto the hive cities. The rocks slammed into the protective void shields of Hive Hell's Reach, shorting out the energy grids with the sheer physical friction of their descent. Once the shields collapsed, the rocks crashed into the upper spires. The heavy rock casings shattered upon impact, deploying millions of greenskins directly into the highest, wealthiest levels of the city. The Orcs swung heavy iron choppers through the stained glass windows of the noble estates, slaughtering the planetary elite before the PDF regiments could ride the transit elevators up from the lower levels. Ghazkul focused the heaviest concentration of his forces around Hades' hive. The warlord's personal rock slammed into the ash plains just outside the primary macro-cannon arc. The heavy iron doors ground open, and Ghazkul marched out onto the dirt. He wore completely new, heavily reinforced mega armor constructed from the salvaged hull plating of a destroyed Imperial cruiser. He raised his massive right arm, pointing the multi-barreled rotary gun at the hive walls. Millions of Orcs poured out of the surrounding dropships, forming a massive green ring around the entire city. The warlord did not issue a general charge. He ordered his artillery crews to move forward and systematically dismantle the outer fortifications, explicitly instructing his clan bosses to keep the human defenders trapped inside the metal walls. Commissar Yarrick stood on the ferrocrete command balcony of Hades' hive. He plugged a data cable directly from the tactical auger into his bionic eye, analyzing the Orc troop movements across the entire continent. He watched the red blips of the Orc artillery lines form a perfect, continuous circle around the hive. He looked out over the ash plains, scanning the green tide, and locked his single organic eye onto the massive, black-armored form of Gazkul. Yarrick raised his Orc power claw, pointing the heavy iron blades directly at the warlord. He spoke into his master Voxcaster, ordering the Imperial macro cannons to ignore the advancing infantry and focus all their explosive payload specifically on the Orc artillery emplacements. The Third War across Armageddon immediately devolved into isolated, planetary-scale meat grinders. The Black Templars Space Marines deployed from their strike cruisers directly into the burning streets of Hive Hell's Reach. They wore black ceramite armor, adorned with stark white crosses, and chained their bolters and chainswords directly to their wrists. The Black Templars fought the Orcs block by block, turning the wide transit avenues into massive killing zones. They set up heavy bolter nests inside the ruined cathedrals, firing mass reactive shells down into the green swarms. The salamanders operated exclusively in the equatorial jungle, using their heavy flamers to burn the Orc encampments and vaporize the dense vegetation, preventing the greenskins from using the cover to mask their movements between the two continents. Inside the ash wastes, the Armageddon Steel Legion engaged the Orc armored columns in massive tank battles. Thousands of Lehman Russ demolishers formed long firing lines, unleashing rolling barrages of high-explosive plasma that melted the crude armor of the Orc battle wagons. The Orcs retaliated by driving their vehicles at maximum speed directly into the Imperial lines, ramming the heavier tanks and detonating crude explosive charges strapped to their own hulls. The ash plains became entirely covered in burning metal and thick black smoke. The Steel Legion guardsmen stayed inside their sealed vehicles, refusing to expose themselves to the choking dust and the heavy slugger fire bouncing off their armor plating. Back at Hades' hive, the Orc gargants moved into firing position. They aimed their belly-mounted macro cannons directly at the primary command bunker located near the top of the spire. Gazkul watched the heavy barrels track upward, his mechanical red eye whirring as he focused on the specific ferrocrete balcony where the black-coated commissar stood. The Orc warlord raised his power claw and roared the command to fire. The massive cannons discharged, sending heavy brass shells arching through the smog. The explosions shattered the upper levels of the hive, sending huge chunks of rockcrete and twisted metal crashing down onto the ash plains below. The massive asteroid hurled by Gazkul's fleet struck the direct center of Hades' hive. The kinetic impact instantly vaporized the upper spires and sent a visible shockwave through the planetary crust, overturning heavy transport haulers on the surrounding plains. Millions of tons of ferrocrete, structural steel, and shattered glass collapsed straight into the underhive, burying the entire population under a tidal wave of molten slag. Gazkul directed this specific orbital strike to completely obliterate the physical site of his previous defeat. Commissar Yarrick survived the orbital bombardment by operating from the bridge of a mobile Leviathan command crawler hundreds of miles away in the ash wastes. Yarrick gripped the metal railing of the command deck and watched the massive plume of burning rock and grey ash rise over the horizon through the thick, armored glass. In the southern hemisphere, a separate Orc horde besieged the heavily industrialized port city of Hive Hell's Reach. The Black Templars Space Marine chapter deployed their warriors along the high ferrocrete walls, Reclusiarch Grimaldus, clad in heavy black ceramite skull armor, stood at the edge of the primary docks. He carried a heavy Crozius mace and a plasma pistol. Orc submersibles breached the oily surface of the Tempest Ocean. The crude iron submarines fired heavy explosive torpedoes directly into the massive metal cranes and loading docks, collapsing the steel structures into the churning water. Millions of orcs poured out of the pressure hatches and splashed through the surf, charging up the ferrocrete ramps. Grimaldus swung his mace, crushing the heavy skulls of the advancing greenskins, and directed the concentrated heavy bolter fire of his space marines into the packed alien ranks. The greenskins breached the outer walls of Hell's Reach with heavy explosive charges and flooded the inner hab blocks. The Black Templars retreated to the Temple of the Emperor Ascendant, a massive stone basilica located in the exact center of the hive. Orc gargants rolled forward on their iron treads and fired high-yield plasma blasts into the heavy stone pillars, bringing the massive vaulted roof down on the defenders. Grimaldus stood in the falling rubble, swinging his weapon continuously until green blood completely coated his black armor. The stone temple collapsed entirely, burying the Space Marines under tons of rockcrete. Imperial recovery teams dug through the heavy boulders days later, using plasma cutters and hydraulic lifters. They found Grimaldus physically dragging his broken body out of the debris, carrying the shattered silver relics of the temple tightly in his ceramite gauntlets. Across the open ash wastes, the Armageddon Steel Legion engaged the Orc mechanized units in continuous vehicular combat. Orc buggies fitted with spiked tires and heavy flamers raced across the grey plains, spraying liquid fire over the Imperial infantry lines. The Imperial Lehman Russ tanks fired high explosive shells, flipping the buggies and sending burning shrapnel flying across the dirt. Massive orc walkers, known as stompers, stepped over the burning wreckage, blowing thick black smoke from their exhaust pipes and firing multiple rotary cannons at the retreating Imperial armor. The thick grey dust coated the glass lenses of the targeting augers on both sides, forcing the guardsmen and greenskins to fight at extreme close range. Human soldiers drove standard combat knives deep into the green flesh of the orcs, and the aliens swung crude iron choppers through the yellow coats and flak armor of the Steel Legion. The conflict across Armageddon settled into a permanent planetary war of attrition. Both the Imperial forces and the Orc hordes suffered millions of physical casualties daily, piling the corpses high in the streets and across the plains. Ghazghkull stood on the bridge of his scrap ship and analyzed the endless combat data, scrolling across the green lumen screens. He achieved his primary objective of creating a perpetual, highly concentrated war zone to feed the biological combat requirements of his greenskins. The warlord turned his ship toward the warp translation point, engaging the heavy plasma thrusters and leaving the ground war behind to spread the violent conflict to neighboring sectors. Commissar Yarrick tracked the massive thermal signature of Ghazghkull's flagship, breaking orbit. He ordered his command crawler to travel at maximum speed to the nearest Imperial starport, boarding a Black Templar's strike cruiser and preparing a naval fleet to chase the Orc warlord directly across the galaxy. The heavy brass shells shattered the primary ferrocrete pillars, supporting the upper spire of Hades' hive. The structural steel buckled under the immense weight of the massive macro cannons and void shield generators located on the roof. Thousands of tons of rockcrete, twisted metal beams, and shattered armor glass cascaded downward, crushing the central command bunker. Commissar Yarrick stood on the outer balcony as the floor gave way beneath his boots. The physical collapse of the structure buried the commissar under heavy slabs of stone and iron reinforcement bars, completely severing his connection to the tactical auger networks and silencing his voxcaster. Without Yarrick's continuous physical presence and shouted commands, the defense of Hades' hive faltered. The Imperial Guardsmen dropped their lasguns and scrambled backward over the rubble, abandoning the breached gates. Orc knobs charged through the gaps, swinging their power claws and iron choppers into the retreating crowds. They slaughtered the remaining PDF units, leaving thick layers of blood and severed limbs across the transit corridors. The greenskins pushed deep into the lower hab blocks, tearing the factory workers apart and burning the manufactorums to the ground. Ghazghkull drove his heavily armored battle wagon directly over the crushed barricades, planting his heavy boots on the ruined ferrocrete to claim absolute physical control of the city. In the ash wastes surrounding the fallen hive, the Black Templars retaliated against the advancing Orc Gargants. Space Marine bikers drove fast-moving assault bikes directly into the path of the massive mechanical idols. They fired their twin-linked bolters into the exposed track joints, drawing the attention of the greenskin gunners. Behind the bikers, heavily armored Land Raider tanks established a firing line across a low ridge. The Space Marine gunners fired their twin-linked las cannons simultaneously, focusing the concentrated thermal beams on a single Gargant's knee joint. The intense heat melted the iron pistons, causing the towering machine to topple forward. The massive metal idol crashed into the grey dirt, crushing hundreds of Orc infantrymen beneath its heavy chassis. While the tank battles raged across the plains, Yarrick lay pinned beneath the rubble of the fallen spire. Thick rockcrete dust coated his black storm coat, and blood dripped from a deep laceration across his forehead. He gripped a heavy steel beam with his grafted Orc power claw. The pneumatic pistons hissed as he pushed his mechanical arm upward, slowly lifting the crushing weight off his torso. He dragged himself out of the debris, standing unsteadily on the cracked floor of the ruined balcony. His bionic red eye scanned the destruction below, recording the sight of Orc battle wagons rolling through the streets of the Hive City. Yarrick picked up his bolt pistol, checked the loaded magazine, and stepped into the shadowed service stairwell to begin a localized guerrilla campaign against the occupying aliens. Ghazghkull focused his efforts on completely eliminating the Imperial forces scattered across Armageddon Secundus. The Orc warlord dispatched thousands of heavily armed buggies and warbikes to hunt down the surviving Steel Legion armor. He ordered his weird boys to summon localized warp storms, dropping green lightning directly onto the entrenched positions of the salamanders in the equatorial jungle. The Space Marines fought back fiercely, using heavy flamers and melter guns to burn the advancing greenskins to ash, but the sheer physical volume of the Orc horde slowly forced the Imperial lines to contract. Ghazghkull watched the tactical progress from the ruins of Hades' hive, pacing the crushed marble floors and crushing the skulls of insubordinate clan bosses with his power claw. The constant grind of planetary warfare forced both sides to adapt their military strategies. Imperial engineers constructed heavily armored mobile fortresses out of salvaged Leviathan crawlers, mounting macro cannons and void shield generators onto the massive tracked vehicles. The Steel Legion drove these fortresses across the ash wastes, using them as mobile command centers to coordinate their hit-and-run attacks. The Orcs countered by attaching massive rocket launchers to their battle wagons, firing crude explosive missiles in massive volleys to overwhelm the Imperial void shields. The air over Armageddon filled with the constant roar of explosions and the grinding of heavy tank treads, turning the entire planet into a permanent, highly destructive war zone. Deep beneath the ruined streets of Hades' hive, Yarrick organized a resistance force consisting of surviving guardsmen and hive gangers. They hid in the dark maintenance tunnels, using the intricate knowledge of the local pipe network to bypass the Orc patrols. The humans set tripwire traps using high-explosive crack grenades and strung thin monofilament wire across the dark corridors at neck height. When Orc knobs walked down the tunnels, the wire cleanly severed their heads, dropping their heavy green bodies onto the metal grating. Yarrick led these ambush parties personally, using his Orc power claw to tear through the armor of the greenskins and firing his bolt pistol directly into their faces. He aimed to inflict maximum physical damage and slow the Orc consolidation of the Hive City, waiting for the heavily armored Space Marine strike forces to launch a coordinated counterattack from orbit. The massive orbital strike destroyed the upper half of Hades' hive, reducing the primary defense grid to twisted steel beams and shattered rockcrete. The shockwaves traveled down through the structural supports, cracking the ferrocrete walls of the lower hab blocks. Deep within the underhive, Yarrick and his surviving guardsmen felt the ground violently shake beneath their boots. They moved rapidly through the dark maintenance tunnels, stepping over the corpses of Orc commandos and discarded ammunition crates. Yarrick raised his heavy power claw, crushing the iron hatch of a service elevator and leading his men upward through the smoke and settling dust. The commissar emerged onto a ruined observation deck, tracking the massive, black-armored form of Ghazghkull moving directly through the center of the breached city. Ghazghkull drove his heavily reinforced battle wagon over the crushed Imperial barricades. He raised his multi-barreled rotary gun, firing rapid bursts of heavy solid slugs into the retreating PDF regiments. The massive warlord directed his clan bosses to fan out across the hab blocks, ordering them to slaughter the civilian population and completely dismantle the surviving industrial sectors. Ghazghkull physically ripped the silver Imperial eagles from the walls of the shattered cathedrals, crushing the metal icons in his adamantium claw and tossing the scrap into the churning tracks of his battle wagon. He wanted to completely erase the physical memory of the Imperial city, turning the massive industrial center into an open field of grey ash and broken rock. High in the upper atmosphere, the Imperial Navy initiated a massive orbital drop. Thousands of heavy landing craft broke through the thick green smog, their plasma thrusters burning bright blue against the darkened sky. The Black Templars Space Marines deployed directly into the active war zones. They wore black ceramite armor, adorned with stark white crosses, and chained their bolters and chainswords directly to their wrists. The Space Marines charged out of their landing craft, firing mass reactive bolts into the thick green skin of the advancing Orcs. The explosive rounds blew large chunks of muscle and black blood onto the surrounding walls. The Black Templars drove their heavy armored boots directly into the chests of the greenskins, pushing the alien horde back block by block through the narrow transit corridors. The Salamander's Space Marine chapter deployed into the dense equatorial jungle. They wore heavy green power armor and carried thick iron flamers, unleashing continuous torrents of burning promethium into the tightly packed crowds of charging Orcs. The intense heat vaporized the thick green vines and broad-leafed ferns, turning the humid jungle into an open field of burning ash and charred wood. The Space Marines established heavily fortified fire bases along the riverbanks, mounting heavy bolters and las cannons onto the raised earthworks. They fired overlapping barrages of high-explosive plasma into the Orc buggies and battle wagons attempting to cross the shallow water, turning the river Styx into a boiling cauldron of melted iron and burning fuel. Across the open ash wastes, the Armageddon Steel Legion engaged the massive Orc Stompus. Thousands of Lehman Russ demolishers formed long firing lines, unleashing rolling barrages of high-explosive plasma that melted the crude armor of the towering mechanical idols. The Imperial tanks maneuvered continuously through the choking dust storms, using their heavy treads to crush the smaller Orc buggies and infantry formations. The guardsmen stayed inside their sealed vehicles, wearing their mustard yellow trench coats and respirators to block the toxic fumes. They fired their heavy bolters from the side sponsons, shredding the green flesh of the aliens and painting the grey plains red with Orc blood. The scale of the planetary conflict ground the military forces of both sides into total physical exhaustion. Millions of Imperial soldiers and Orc warriors died daily in the shattered streets of the hive cities and the burning plains of the ash wastes. The massive industrial output of Armageddon completely stalled, the factory floors covered in broken machinery and the bodies of slaughtered workers. Gazkul watched the endless meat grinder from the bridge of his scrap ship, pacing the grated decks and assessing the physical attrition of his horde. The warlord realized the Imperial resistance was too heavily entrenched to completely break, and he ordered his fleet to engage their plasma drives and break orbit. Gazkul left millions of his greenskins on the surface of Armageddon to continue the endless war, directing his massive armada back into the warp to launch a new, exponentially larger war across the entire segmentum solar. Commissar Yarrick stood on the ruined command balcony of Hades' hive, tracking the massive thermal signature of the Orc fleet leaving the system. The Commissar gripped the metal railing with his Orc power claw, the hydraulic pistons hissing as he squeezed the steel beam. He looked at the burning city and the millions of dead bodies scattered across the plains. Yarrick understood that the Orc warlord would inevitably return to finish the destruction of Armageddon. He ordered his surviving command staff to prepare a heavy strike cruiser, intending to pursue Gazkul directly into the Immaterium and execute the alien warlord before he could launch another planetary invasion. The Black Templar's strike cruiser matched its orbital velocity with the massive thermal wake of Gazkul's fleeing flagship. Commissar Yarrick stood on the command deck of the Space Marine vessel, his black stormcoat repaired and his bionic red eye glaring at the tactical augurs. High Marshal Helbrecht of the Black Templars stood beside him, encased in highly decorated black Terminator armor and gripping a heavy power sword. Yarrick commanded the helmsman to track the exact warp translation coordinates of the Orc warlord. The massive Imperial cruiser ignited its main plasma drives, accelerating through the debris of the orbital battle, and tore open a rent in reality to plunge directly into the churning tides of the Immaterium. For months of real time, the Black Templar's strike cruiser tracked the psychic residue of Gazkul's scrap fleet through the warp. The pursuit led them across the segmentum solar and deep into the Golgotha sector, a region notorious for heavy Orc activity and localized warp storms. The Imperial augurs eventually detected the massive physical silhouette of the Orc flagship dropping back into real space near the Golgotha system. Yarrick ordered the strike cruiser to immediately follow. The Black Templar's vessel breached the Immaterium, appearing directly in the path of the Orc armada. Gazkul anticipated the pursuit. He had intentionally led the Imperial ship into a massive ambush. Millions of Orc scrap ships, previously hidden behind the dense asteroid fields of the Golgotha system, powered up their crude plasma drives and surrounded the isolated strike cruiser. The Greenskin armada opened fire simultaneously, unloading millions of explosive shells and heavy solid slugs against the Imperial void shields. The shields flared bright blue and collapsed under the overwhelming kinetic pressure. Heavy macro cannons tore through the black ceramite hull of the strike cruiser, venting atmosphere and entire squads of space marines directly into the void. Orc boarding torpedoes slammed into the flanks of the Imperial ship. The heavy iron tips ground through the bulkheads, and thousands of green-skinned warriors poured into the narrow transit corridors. Helbrecht and his Black Templars fought the boarding parties deck by deck, swinging chainswords and firing mass-reactive bolters in the cramped spaces. The Orcs absorbed the heavy casualties, using their overwhelming physical mass to push the Space Marines back toward the command bridge. Ghazghkull himself breached the primary blast doors of the bridge, his heavy mega armor sparking as it deflected incoming las fire. Yarrick stood at the center of the bridge, raising his Orc power claw and firing his bolt pistol directly at the warlord. Ghazghkull ignored the explosive rounds bouncing off his adamantium chestplate. He charged forward, swinging his own heavy power claw and catching Yarrick completely off guard. The massive blades clamped around the Commissar's torso, crushing his ribs and puncturing his lungs. Yarrick slumped forward, physically paralyzed by the massive internal trauma. Ghazghkull did not execute the Commissar. Instead, the warlord ordered his nobs to bind Yarrick in heavy iron chains and drag his bleeding body back to the Orc flagship, capturing the human commander alive. Ghazghkull threw Yarrick into a rusted metal cage suspended directly over the primary fighting pits of the Orc scrapship. For weeks, the warlord forced the Commissar to watch the greenskins brutalize each other in physical combat. Ghazghkull occasionally descended to the pits, using his bionic red eye to study Yarrick's reactions to the localized violence. The warlord respected the sheer physical resilience and tactical mind of the Commissar. He required Yarrick to remain alive, to organize future Imperial resistance, ensuring that the Orcs would always have a challenging enemy to fight. After months of captivity, Ghazghkull ordered his guards to drag Yarrick to the primary launch bays. The Orcs threw the heavily injured Commissar into a small, unarmed escape shuttle and programmed the navigation cogitators for the nearest Imperial outpost. Ghazghkull stood on the metal grate of the launch bay, pointing his power claw at the shuttle. He roared a specific message through the open airlock, telling Yarrick to return to the Imperium and prepare for the greatest war the galaxy had ever seen. The Orc warlord then slammed his heavy fist against the launch controls, ejecting the shuttle directly into the void. Yarrick lay on the metal floor of the small craft, bleeding and exhausted, his bionic red eye glowing in the darkness as he processed the sheer scale of the upcoming greenskin threat. High Marshal Helbrecht stood on the heavily scorched bridge of the Black Templar's strike cruiser, assessing the massive physical damage inflicted by the Orc boarding parties. Tech Marines used heavy plasma cutters to seal the breached bulkheads, and servitors dragged the green corpses of the Orc nobs out of the primary access corridors. The Space Marines initiated a full tactical retreat from the Golgotha system, firing their heavy thrusters to push the damaged cruiser back to the nearest warp translation point. Helbrecht ordered his astropaths to immediately broadcast a high-priority distress signal, completely abandoning his pursuit of the Orc warlord in order to report the physical capture of Commissar Yarrick directly to the High Lords of Terra. Months later, an automated Imperial cargo freighter intercepted the small, unarmed escape shuttle drifting through the void near the Segmentum solar border. Navy armsmen forced the heavy metal hatch open and found Yarrick lying on the cold deck plates. The Commissar's black stormcoat hung in tatters, and the flesh around his bionic red eye was heavily infected. Medics hauled his physically broken body onto a transport stretcher and carried him directly to the freighter's surgical bay. Yarrick grabbed the collar of the lead medic with his remaining human hand, pulling the man down and hoarsely demanding a direct, secure Vox channel to Segmentum Command before allowing the surgeons to inject him with painkillers. The physical confirmation of Ghazkul's impending return triggered an immediate and unprecedented military buildup across Armageddon. The Adeptus Mechanicus deployed billions of indentured workers to physically connect the remaining hive cities with massive, elevated transit rails. These heavy ferrocrete bridges spanned the ash wastes, allowing armored supply trains to move directly between the industrial sectors without touching the ground. Tech priests installed thousands of heavy macro cannons along the upper ridges of the equatorial jungle, pointing the massive barrels directly at the northern transit routes. The Departamento Munitorum ordered the immediate conscription of every able-bodied citizen on the planet, handing lasguns to factory workers and forcing them into the hastily dug trench lines surrounding Armageddon Prime. Yarrick returned to Armageddon, stepping off a heavy transport lander onto the reinforced ferrocrete of Hive Tartarus. He wore a newly tailored black stormcoat and carried his bolt pistol strapped to his hip. The commissar walked the newly expanded defense perimeter, his heavy orc power claw clanking against his thigh. He stood over the tactical plotting tables, personally directing the placement of heavily armored bunkers and void shield generators. Yarrick explicitly refused to let the planetary commanders rely solely on defensive fortifications. He ordered the creation of highly mobile, rapid-response tank battalions within the Armageddon Steel Legion, specifically designed to intercept and engage the Orc Stompas before the massive mechanical idols could reach the hive walls. 57 years passed, and the physical preparations transformed Armageddon into a massive fortress world. Space Marine strike cruisers from over 20 different chapters locked themselves into high orbit, their launch bays packed with drop pods and Thunderhawk gunships. The orbital defense platforms bristled with heavy lance batteries and loaded cyclonic torpedo tubes. The air above the hive cities tasted permanently of burning promethium and ozone, generated by the constant hum of the overlapping void shields. Millions of Imperial Guardsmen stood shoulder to shoulder in the trenches, their mustard-yellow coats covered in the grey ash constantly blowing across the plains. Deep within the Immaterium, Ghazkul Mag Uruk Thraka finalized his massive. He had spent the last 5 decades physically beating thousands of rival Orc empires into total submission. The warlord commanded a fleet so massive, its sheer psychic footprint disrupted the navigational equipment of nearby Imperial vessels. He stood on the bridge of his flagship, surrounded by hundreds of heavily armored war bosses. Ghazkul raised his massive power claw and slammed it into the central command console, ordering the Weird Boys to tear open the physical fabric of real space. The massive Orc armada dropped out of the warp directly above the Armageddon system, blocking out the light of the sun and casting a shadow that covered the entire surface of the fortified ash world. The massive Orc armada slammed into the defensive grid of the Armageddon system. Thousands of space hulks, excavated asteroids, and welded scrap ships pushed through the void, driving directly toward the heavily armored Imperial cruisers. Admiral Parole commanded the Imperial Navy forces from the bridge of his flagship, standing over the brass tactical displays. He ordered his gunnery crews to fire continuous broadsides. Bright blue lance beams and heavy macro cannon shells struck the leading Orc vessels. The concentrated thermal energy melted the crude iron hulls, sending molten metal and frozen oxygen venting into the blackness of space. The Greenskin fleet absorbed the physical damage and accelerated. The massive Orc space hulks rammed directly into the sides of the Imperial Gothic-class cruisers. The physical impact shattered the overlapping void shields, buckling the adamantium armor plates and crushing the internal decks. Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka orchestrated the planetary assault from his command throne. He directed his mech boys to ignite the heavy plasma thrusters mounted on the largest asteroids in the fleet. These massive chunks of rock and iron detached from the Armada and plummeted toward the surface of Armageddon Prime and Armageddon Secundus. The asteroids pierced the upper atmosphere, trailing thick streams of burning atmospheric gas and shedding outer layers of rockcrete. The Imperial ground commanders watched the sky turn bright orange. They ordered their anti-aircraft batteries and heavy defense lasers to fire upward. The bright red beams struck the descending asteroids, chipping away heavy boulders, and the massive physical weight of the projectiles carried them downward to the surface. The Orc rocks impacted the ash wastes and the outer industrial sectors of the hive cities. The kinetic force of the collisions cracked the planetary crust, sending massive shockwaves rolling across the grey dirt. The tremors flipped Lehman Russ demolisher tanks onto their turrets and shattered the thick ferrocrete walls of the forward Imperial bunkers. A specially targeted asteroid struck the exact center of Hades' hive. The extreme velocity and weight of the projectile pulverized the upper spires instantly. The structural steel beams snapped, and millions of tons of stone collapsed downward, burying the lower hab blocks under a mountain of crushed rubble and twisted metal. Gazkul erased the physical site of his previous campaign in a single catastrophic strike. The embedded rocks served as heavily fortified staging bases for the greenskin invasion. Thick iron blast doors ground open along the base of the fallen asteroids. Millions of orcs surged out into the settling dust clouds. The warriors possessed thick green skin, heavy yellow tusks, and dense muscle mass. They carried high-caliber sluggers, heavy flame projectors, and rusted chain axes. The greenskins trampled over the crushed remains of the Imperial forward trenches, firing rapid bursts of solid projectiles into the mustard yellow coats of the Armageddon Steel Legion. The human defenders held their positions in the secondary trench networks. Commissars walked along the duckboards, pointing their bolt pistols toward the advancing green tide and shouting firing orders over the explosive blasts. The Steel Legion guardsmen braced their heavy bolters on sandbags, pulling the triggers to send continuous streams of mass reactive rounds into the orc mobs. The explosive shells detonated inside the torsos of the greenskins, spraying black blood and shattered bone across the dirt. Artillery crews loaded heavy earthshaker rounds into their basilisk cannons, pulling the lanyards to launch the massive shells high over the battlefield. The artillery strikes blasted deep craters in the ash wastes, throwing severed orc limbs and burning vehicle parts into the air. Space Marine strike cruisers deployed their forces directly into the heaviest zones of the planetary conflict. Heavy metal drop pods fell from the launch bays, slamming into the ground between the orc rocks and the hive walls. The explosive bolts blew the heavy iron ramps outward. Black Templars clad in dark ceramite charged onto the plains, swinging power swords that crackled with blue energy. They cut directly through the dense green muscle and thick bone of the orc front lines. Salamanders in green armor marched out of heavy transport landers, raising double-barreled flamers. They sprayed liquid promethium over the advancing greenskins, incinerating the alien warriors and leaving piles of smoking ash on the ferrocrete roadways. The constant exchange of heavy ordnance turned the vast plains between the hive cities into a churning wasteland of mud, black alien blood, and burning metal. Orc battle wagons, fitted with spiked iron rollers, ground over the sandbag barricades, crushing Imperial guardsmen under heavy treads. Imperial Titans walked through the thick grey smog, firing massive plasma destructors that melted Orc armored columns into bubbling pools of glowing slag. The air filled with the sharp stench of vaporized flesh, spilled chemical coolant, and burning brass ammunition casings. Humans and greenskins clashed in tight proximity, driving combat knives into green muscle and swinging rusted axes through yellow trench coats across the ruined transit corridors of the fortified world. The rotation of Armageddon brought the planet into its summer cycle, known to the local population as the Season of Fire. The ambient temperature rose drastically across the continents. The tectonic shifts, caused by the massive asteroid impacts, triggered deep volcanic eruptions across the southern fire wastes. Plumes of thick black smoke and superheated magma shot thousands of feet into the air. Rivers of molten rock poured over the cracked ferrocrete highways, melting the rusted hulls of destroyed tanks and turning the lower ash wastes into a glowing, impassable plain. The Armageddon Steel Legion guardsmen stayed inside their heavily insulated chimeras, regulating their internal coolant systems to prevent heat stroke. The thick mustard-yellow coats absorbed the sweat of the human defenders as they operated their heavy bolters through the narrow firing slits. The Orcs physically adapted to the extreme heat. The greenskins shed their heavy scrap metal armor, exposing their thick green skin directly to the scorching ash winds. Mech boys gathered the melted iron and constructed massive, heat-shielded battle wagons with wide spiked treads designed to roll directly over the molten lava flows. The greenskins drove these heavy vehicles across the fire wastes, bypassing the entrenched Imperial positions entirely. They struck the southern manufactorums of Hive Infernus, crashing through the outer transit gates. The factory workers inside dropped their welding torches and picked up heavy iron wrenches, fighting the towering aliens face to face on the metal assembly lines. Meanwhile, the conflict extended into the polluted waters of the Tempest Ocean. The Orcs utilized the deep underwater shipyards built during the previous war. They deployed fleets of crude submersible vessels constructed from the hollowed hulls of sunken cargo freighters. These scrap submarines fired heavy torpedoes into the underwater support columns of the Imperial offshore drilling platforms. The thick steel pillars snapped under the kinetic force, collapsing the platforms into the dark water. Imperial Navy destroyers dropped depth charges into the ocean in response, sending massive columns of boiling water high into the air and crushing the Orc submersibles under the intense hydrostatic pressure. Dead greenskins and shredded green fungus floated to the oily surface of the ocean, washing up against the ferrocrete seawalls of Port Hellsreach. Above the boiling oceans and burning ash wastes, the air war consumed millions of aircraft. Orc fighter bombers powered by crude jet engines filled the sky. They flew in massive, disorganized swarms, firing streams of high-caliber bullets into the Imperial Thunderbolt fighters. The Imperial pilots maintained rigid flight formations, firing synchronized volleys of las cannon beams that sliced cleanly through the unshielded Orc jets. The burning wreckage of thousands of aircraft rained down continuously, crashing into the Hive cities and detonating among the packed infantry lines on the ground. The constant barrage of anti-aircraft flak and exploding engines filled the sky with physical debris, replacing the clouds with a solid canopy of black smoke and falling metal. Thousands of wounded guardsmen lay on the grated floors of the field hospitals in Hive Tartarus. Medical servitors operated continuously among the bleeding soldiers. Their hydraulic limbs whirred and clicked as they amputated shattered limbs and stitched deep lacerations. Tech priests pumped thousands of gallons of synthetic blood substitutes into the veins of the wounded guardsmen, pushing them out of the surgical beds and sending them directly back to the defensive trenches. The soldiers returned to the front lines, missing eyes and arms, gripping their lasguns with newly attached cybernetic prosthetics, and firing into the endless waves of charging green warriors. Out in the ash wastes, the biological reality of the greenskins sustained the massive alien horde. When an orc died from heavy bolter fire or artillery shrapnel, its body released millions of physical fungal spores directly into the wind. The green spores settled into the warm ash and took root deep within the soil. Within weeks, thick subterranean pods swelled beneath the ground. New, fully formed orc warriors clawed their way up through the dirt. They emerged with dense muscles and sharp tusks, picking up the rusted choppers dropped by the previous generations and running straight toward the nearest Imperial bunker. The continuous artillery barrages fertilized the soil with orc remains, ensuring the green tide replenished its numbers perpetually. Deep within his primary command rock, Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka stood before a massive plotting table. He watched the green and red markers representing millions of troops stall along the borders of the hive cities. The Space Marines and the Steel Legion maintained constant fields of fire from the thick ferrocrete walls of the primary hives, and the orcs bred millions of new warriors in the fungal pits of the ash wastes. The battle lines stopped moving entirely. Gazkul studied the static map and walked away from the display screen. He ordered his personal retinue of nobs to prepare his heavily armored boarding craft, intending to leave the surface of Armageddon and carry his perfected war strategies to the other highly populated sectors of the galaxy. The Black Templars' strike cruiser transitioned out of the warp and dropped directly into the upper atmosphere of the Golgotha system. The Imperial void ship pushed through the thin atmospheric drag of a barren, rust-colored planet. The augurs identified millions of thermal contacts scattered across the rocky terrain below, and a single, massive energy signature originating from a heavily fortified orc staging camp. High Marshal Helbrecht stood on the bridge, his black power armor reflecting the harsh glare of the tactical screens. He ordered his gunnery crews to target the outer perimeter of the orc base. The cruiser fired heavy lance beams, cutting deep trenches into the rust-red dirt and vaporizing the crude iron barricades surrounding the camp. Commissar Yarrick stood beside Helbrecht in the staging bay. He wore a heavily padded drop harness over his black storm coat. He checked the ammunition feed of a custom-built storm bolter and cycled the hydraulic pistons of his orc power claw. The heavy metal joints locked into position with a loud mechanical clank. Space Marines filed into the metal drop pods, clamping their magnetic boots to the deck plates and locking their bolters across their chests. Yarrick stepped into the command pod alongside Helbrecht, securing the heavy iron restraint bars over his shoulders. The launch clamps disengaged, and the drop pods fired their thrusters, shooting downward through the thin atmosphere like massive iron bullets. The pods slammed into the rocky surface, directly inside the orc staging camp. The explosive bolts detonated, blowing the metal doors outward. Black Templars charged out onto the red dirt, firing mass reactive shells into the surrounding greenskins. Helbrecht swung his power sword, cutting entirely through the thick torso of an advancing orc nob. Yarrick stepped out of the pod and immediately aimed his bionic red eye at the massive central command structure, a towering fortress constructed from welded tank hulls and thick adamantium plates. He pointed his power claw at the bunker, ordering the Space Marine Devastator squads to direct their heavy las cannons at the primary blast doors. The concentrated thermal beams melted the hinges, causing the heavy iron doors to crash onto the dirt. Jarek and Helbrecht led the charge into the Orc fortress. The interior smelled of unwashed fungus and burning promethium. Millions of sparks showered from the severed electrical cables hanging from the ceiling. Orc meganobs, clad in thick, rusted power armor, blocked the main transit corridor. They swung heavy circular saws and hydraulic claws, tearing through the ceramite armor of the leading Black Templars. Jarek stepped forward, firing rapid bursts from his storm bolter directly into the exposed facial features of the greenskins. He caught the swinging saw of a meganob with his own power claw, the metal teeth grinding against the adamantium blades. Jarek pushed the heavy orc backward and drove his bolter directly into the greenskin's stomach, pulling the trigger until the magazine clicked empty. They pushed deeper into the fortress, stepping over the mangled bodies of orcs and space marines. At the center of the structure, they found the primary command chamber, completely empty. Heavy tactical maps lay scattered across a rusted iron table, and a single, massive Voxcaster unit sat in the corner, broadcasting a continuous loop of guttural orc laughter. Helbrecht drove his power sword into the Voxcaster, silencing the transmission. Jarek scanned the room with his bionic eye, analyzing the scuff marks on the floor and the discarded ammunition crates. He realized Ghazghkull had not established a permanent base on Golgotha. The warlord had used the planet solely as a temporary staging point, fully anticipating the Imperial pursuit. The orbital augers aboard the strike cruiser pinged rapidly. The tactical officers on the bridge transmitted an emergency physical report to Helbrecht's helmet receiver. The massive thermal signature they had tracked through the warp did not belong to Ghazghkull's flagship. The Orcs had strapped heavily modified warp engines to a massive hollowed-out asteroid, programming it to continuously emit a localized psychic signal that perfectly mimicked the footprint of the warlord's vessel. The entire pursuit had been a deliberate, physical misdirection. Ghazghkull had diverted the Black Templars and the Commissar away from the Segmentum Solar, leaving the actual Greenskin Armada completely free to strike a new, unprotected target. Jarek stood in the empty Orc bunker, the hydraulic pistons of his power claw venting steam into the stale air. He recognized the tactical sophistication of the maneuver, acknowledging that the Orc warlord possessed a strategic mind far beyond the typical brutal aggression of his species. Helbrecht ordered his space marines to fall back to the landing zones and prepare for immediate extraction. The Black Templars marched out of the fortress, firing their remaining bolter rounds into the surviving greenskins scattered across the rust-red dirt. The Imperial forces boarded their Thunderhawk gunships and lifted back into the thin atmosphere, leaving the empty decoy asteroid burning on the barren plains. Jarek stared out the viewport of the gunship, calculating the physical distance back to Armageddon and realizing the warlord was already years ahead of them. The Imperial defenders and the remaining Orc hordes continued their physical combat across the surface of Armageddon. Millions of greenskins, left behind by Ghazghkull, gathered around the massive impact craters of the asteroid dropships. Orc mechboys welded rusted iron plates to the chassis of destroyed Lehman Russ tanks, building crude battle wagons in the middle of the ash plains. Armageddon Steel Legion guardsmen stood in the deep trench networks outside Hive Infernus. The soldiers swapped out the melted barrels of their heavy bolters and stacked fresh brass ammunition crates in the mud. They fired continuous bursts into the advancing Orc infantry, shredding the green flesh and bone of the aliens. The physical accumulation of dead bodies formed temporary barricades, forcing both sides to climb over mounds of rotting meat to engage in close-quarters combat with combat knives and chain axes. The sky above the segmentum solar violently tore open, a massive rift of raw warp energy, physically splitting the galaxy in half, expanded across the void. The thick grey smog covering Armageddon parted as the atmospheric pressure dropped drastically. The natural light of the sun vanished, replaced entirely by a glowing band of bruised purple and blood-red energy stretching from one horizon to the other. Scribes in the central command spires dropped their autoquills and clutched their skulls. Astropaths, strapped into their communication chairs, convulsed, blood pouring from their ears and tear ducts as the sheer psychic noise of the rift overloaded their nervous systems. Voxcaster networks across the planet emitted high-pitched static, completely severing the communication channels between the Imperial artillery batteries and the frontline infantry. The sheer volume of physical blood spilled into the soil of Armageddon over decades of warfare drew the direct attention of the Immaterium. The ground in the equatorial jungle and the open ash wastes fractured. Pools of stagnant water and coagulated blood began to boil, releasing thick clouds of sulfurous steam. Daemons of corn physically manifested from the gore. Bloodletters with scaled red skin, elongated skulls, and heavy horns pulled themselves directly out of the mud. They raised jagged brass swords and marched toward the nearest heat signatures. Massive bloodthirsters stepped through localized tears in reality, their cloven hooves crushing the ferrocrete roadways. They unfurled heavy, leathery wings and swung axes the size of armored transports. The planetary conflict instantly transformed into a massive three-way engagement. The Orcs immediately turned their heavy choppers and sluggers toward the newly materialized daemons. Green-skin knobs charged the bloodthirsters, swinging motorized power claws directly at the brass-armored legs of the towering warp entities. The daemons swung their heavy axes, cleaving the large orcs in half and scattering their green internal organs across the dirt. The greenskins roared loudly, completely ignoring their massive casualties, and fired explosive rocket projectiles into the dense packs of bloodletters. The combat between the aliens and the daemons generated massive shockwaves, shattering the surrounding rockcrete ruins and churning the ash wastes into a deep crater of mud and mixed blood. The orcs drove their spiked buggies into the demonic lines, spinning their wheels over the brass-armored bodies and unleashing torrents of promethium from their heavy flamers. Space Marine commanders in the Hive cities rapidly redirected their heavy weapons to establish a new defensive perimeter. Salamanders standing on the outer walls of Hive Acheron lowered their heavy flamers and sprayed pressurized liquid promethium directly into the demonic ranks, clashing with the orcs. The chemical fire clung to the brass scales of the bloodletters, burning their physical forms to ash and forcing their essence back into the warp. Ultramarines inside their Predator executioner tanks pivoted their turrets, firing concentrated plasma beams through the chests of the larger demons and detonating orc battle wagons in the same sweeping volley. The Imperial forces pulled their infantry squads back behind the overlapping void shields of the primary hives, locking the heavy adamantium gates and fortifying the choke points with overlapping fields of las cannon fire. The physical presence of the galactic rift isolated the Armageddon system completely from the wider Imperium. Imperial Navy destroyers in orbit lost all navigational auger capability, drifting blindly as warp lightning struck their outer hull plating and shorted out their main plasma drives. The planetary commanders analyzed the tactical pict feeds inside their sealed bunkers. They recorded the orcs and the daemons slaughtering each other by the millions across the open plains, while the surviving human populations huddled in the deep subterranean levels of the Hive cities. The officers recognized the physical impossibility of calling for outside reinforcements through the churning warp storm. The human defenders checked their remaining ammunition stockpiles and locked their bayonets into position, preparing to fight a permanent, multi-sided siege on the surface of a world locked entirely in darkness. The physical separation of Armageddon from the wider Imperium lasted for several months of real time. The warp storm eventually began to dissipate, the thick purple and red energy slowly retracting back into the localized rifts. The grey smog returned, covering the upper spires of the surviving hive cities. Imperial astropaths immediately flooded the cleared warp channels with extreme priority distress signals. The returning tactical data confirmed the physical presence of demonic entities fighting alongside the millions of orcs still occupying the planet. The Segmentum Command processed the auger readings and dispatched heavy reinforcements, focusing entirely on Space Marine chapters equipped to handle both greenskin armor and warp manifestations. A massive Imperial fleet translated back into the Armageddon system, led by the heavy strike cruisers of the Blood Angels. Commander Dante coordinated the orbital deployment, directing his drop pods and Thunderhawk gunships toward the massive craters in the equatorial jungle, where the demonic incursions were heavily concentrated. The Blood Angels landed in the burning ash, firing their bolters directly into the warring mobs of orcs and bloodletters. The sudden influx of heavily armored Imperial troops forced the greenskins to break contact with the daemons. The orcs turned their battle wagons and charged the Space Marine lines, allowing the bloodletters to completely surround the Imperial drop zones. Inside the ruins of Hades' hive, Commissar Yarick received the orbital transmission confirming the arrival of the Blood Angels. He ordered his surviving PDF units to push out of the maintenance tunnels and assault the Orc Gargants occupying the upper spires. The guardsmen fired their lasguns into the exposed track joints of the massive mechanical idols, distracting the Orc gunners while Space Marine Devastator squads fired localized las cannon barrages from the surrounding hab blocks. The combined crossfire melted the thick iron armor of the Gargants, bringing the massive machines crashing down into the ruined streets. Yarick marched through the rubble, his orc power claw crushing the skulls of the surviving greenskins, and secured a physical landing zone for the incoming Imperial transports. The Blood Angels engaged the Bloodthirsters in the equatorial jungle. Commander Dante activated his jump pack, launching himself directly at the largest demon. He swung his heavy power axe, the blue energy blade slicing completely through the thick brass scales and severing the daemon's right arm. The Bloodthirster roared and swung its remaining hand, knocking Dante backward into the mud. The Space Marines formed a tight defensive circle around their chapter master, firing mass-reactive bolts into the daemon's chest. The explosive rounds shattered the entity's physical form, sending the monster back into the warp. The remaining daemons lost their physical cohesion and melted into pools of boiling blood, leaving the Space Marines to face the massive orc hordes pouring out of the jungle tree line. The renewed planetary conflict pushed the orcs out of the major hive cities. The greenskins retreated into the open ash wastes, constructing massive, heavily fortified scrap cities from the remains of their destroyed vehicles. They dragged the wrecked hulls of Lehman Russ tanks and the melted chassis of Imperial Titans into tight circular formations, welding the heavy armor plates together to form thick defensive walls. The orcs mounted thousands of heavy macro cannons and rocket launchers along the barricades, pointing the crude artillery directly at the advancing Imperial armored columns. The war devolved into a brutal, static siege, with millions of guardsmen living in muddy trenches and firing continuously at the rusted metal walls of the alien fortresses. Yarrick stood on the command deck of his mobile Leviathan crawler, observing the heavily entrenched Orc positions through the thick armored glass. He recognized the physical impossibility of completely eradicating the greenskin presence on Armageddon. The Orcs continually released spores into the ash, growing new warriors deep beneath the ground to replace their massive casualties. The Commissar ordered his artillery crews to maintain a constant, rolling barrage against the scrap cities, ensuring the greenskins never gained enough physical momentum to launch another coordinated assault against the Hive cities. He kept his bolt pistol loaded and his bionic red eye focused on the ash plains, fully committed to fighting the aliens until the last drop of blood was spilled on the grey dirt. The physical environment of Armageddon shifted under the constant exposure to the warp rift. The grey ash wastes fused into jagged plains of purple glass and crystallized blood. Heavy brass pillars pushed upward through the crust of the southern hemisphere, projecting localized heat waves and emitting the smell of burning copper. Daemons of Khorne marched continuously from the boiling ocean, swinging heavy black iron swords at the Orc fortifications. The greenskins embraced the endless physical combat. Millions of Orcs threw themselves at the demonic lines, crashing their crude battle wagons into the brass pillars and firing heavy sluggers into the chests of the bloodthirsters. The dead bodies of aliens and warp entities piled high across the plains, decomposing into a thick sludge that fertilized the next generation of subterranean Orc spores. The human population adapted to the permanent state of total planetary warfare. Inside the remaining Hive cities, the assembly lines operated continuously. Factory workers with ash-stained hands and chemical burns pulled heavy levers, stamping out millions of las packs and artillery shells. Servitors dragged the finished munitions directly from the cooling racks to the transit elevators. The Armageddon Steel Legion established generational encampments within the deep trench networks outside the Hive walls. Guardsmen lived their entire lives between the ferrocrete bunkers and the razor wire. They slept on mud-soaked cots, ate recycled nutrient paste from tin ration cans, and fired heavy bolters at the advancing green and red tides. Space Marine chapters held the primary choke points across the continents. The salamanders stood on the main transit bridges, firing thick streams of liquid promethium to incinerate the Orc infantry attempting to cross the rivers. The Black Templars maintained highly mobile kill teams, driving their armored assault bikes through the ruins of Hive Hades to hunt down emerging demonic manifestations. The Imperial defenders utilized heavy void shields to deflect the continuous Orc artillery barrages and demonic warp fire. The localized energy domes glowed bright blue against the darkened sky, illuminating the endless waves of attackers throwing themselves against the defensive perimeters. Far from the Armageddon system, a heavily encrypted astropathic signal crossed the segmentum solar. The psychic transmission reached the central communications spire of Hive Fleet Command. The stationed astropaths convulsed in their copper chairs, bleeding from their gums and nostrils as they translated the raw psychic data into printed text. Scribes pulled the heavy parchment from the cogitators and carried the physical reports to the high commanders. The ink detailed the physical demise of Commissar Sebastian Yarrick. The tactical data indicated the old commander had fallen in combat, his physical body broken far out in the void beyond the Armageddon system. The commanders relayed the transmission down to the front lines through the planetary Vox network. The heavy brass speakers mounted on the bunker walls broadcast the confirmed death of the Commissar. Down in the mud of the trenches, the Armageddon Steel Legion guardsmen halted their supply details. They listened to the static-filled audio feed, their hands gripping the handles of their combat knives and the stocks of their lasguns. Grey ash mixed with the physical tears streaming down the faces of the veteran soldiers. They stared out at the orc scrap cities and the burning demonic portals, recognizing the loss of the commander who had physically organized the defense of their world for over 50 years. The high priests inside the armored cathedrals of Hive Secundus grabbed the thick hemp ropes attached to the massive iron bells. They pulled the ropes downward with their full body weight, swinging the heavy iron clappers against the thick brass rims. The deep, vibrating tolls echoed across the transit corridors, rattling the stained glass windows and carrying out over the ash wastes. The ringing bells signaled the physical end of the commissar to the millions of laborers working the assembly lines. Out in the mud, Space Marines of the Black Templars and Salamanders paused their patrols. The towering warriors raised their bolters and struck their ceramite breastplates with their armored fists, issuing a synchronized, booming physical salute to the fallen human commander. The confirmation of Yarick's death triggered a massive shift in the combat behavior of the Imperial forces. The guardsmen slotted fresh power packs into their lasguns and affixed their long steel bayonets to the barrel lugs. Tank commanders loaded high-explosive shells into the breeches of their demolisher cannons, engaging the heavy plasma drives and pushing the throttles forward. The orc mobs paused their infighting, turning their massive green heads toward the human trenches. The greenskins heard the booming iron bells and watched the massive columns of Imperial armor roll directly over the ferrocrete barricades. The Steel Legion officers raised their chainswords, pointing the motorized blades directly toward the orc lines. The human defenders launched a massive, synchronized counteroffensive across the entire western continent, driving their tanks straight into the center of the alien and demonic hordes to exact physical retribution for their fallen leader. The massive Imperial counteroffensive crashed into the orc scrap cities. Lehman Russ demolishers drove their heavy iron plows directly through the welded barricades, crushing the corrugated metal walls and grinding over the green bodies of the defenders. Armageddon Steel Legion guardsmen poured through the breaches, firing their lasguns from the hip as they cleared the cramped alleyways of the orc settlements. They threw frag grenades into the heavily fortified pillboxes, the explosions sending rusted shrapnel and green limbs flying through the grey smoke. The Space Marines spearheaded the deepest penetrations. The Black Templars marched down the central thoroughfares, their heavy bolters tearing apart the orc knobs attempting to organize a defense. They swung their chainswords continuously, severing the heavy lower jaws and thick arms of the greenskins in synchronized strikes. The Daemons of Khorne recognized the sudden surge of Imperial aggression. Bloodthirsters unfurled their leathery wings and launched themselves over the orc barricades, landing directly in the path of the Space Marine armored columns. The massive warp entities swung their heavy battle axes, completely destroying the turrets of the Lehman Russ tanks and flipping the heavy vehicles onto their sides. The Imperial forces did not break formation. Salamander's Devastator squads braced their heavy weapons against the debris, firing concentrated volleys of multi-melter blasts directly into the chests of the Bloodthirsters. The intense thermal energy vaporized the brass scales and underlying demonic muscle, forcing the entities to dissipate back into the immaterium in clouds of red ash. The Steel Legion infantry marched over the burning remains, maintaining a relentless forward pressure against the fractured orc mobs. The intense, localized fighting fractured the massive orc horde into millions of isolated warbands. Without the absolute physical authority of Gazkul to direct their movements, the greenskins reverted to their most basic biological instincts. Rival clan bosses fought each other over the remaining scrap and ammunition, ignoring the advancing imperial forces entirely to settle petty territorial disputes. Entire mobs of boys threw down their sluggers and charged the Space Marine lines bare-handed, seeking a fast, physically violent end in the face of overwhelming firepower. The Imperial artillery batteries pounded the largest concentrations of greenskins, turning entire sectors of the ash wastes into muddy craters filled with green blood and shattered bone. Despite the massive Imperial push, the physical toll of the permanent war continued to mount. The Steel Legion lost entire regiments daily, their mustard yellow coats buried beneath the endless piles of orc corpses. The Space Marine chapters rotated their remaining forces back to the orbital strike cruisers, their ceramite armor heavily dented and covered in the dark stains of alien and demonic blood. The factory workers in the hive cities worked double shifts, their physical frames deteriorating from the constant exposure to toxic fumes and lack of sleep. The planetary commanders authorized the use of heavy combat stims, injecting the frontline soldiers with chemical compounds that numbed their pain receptors and kept them standing long after their physical bodies should have collapsed. The warp rift above Armageddon slowly began to close. The intense purple and red light faded from the sky, replaced once again by the thick, choking grey smog of the heavily industrialized world. The demonic manifestations decreased significantly, the physical connection to the immaterium weakening as the localized warp energy dissipated. The remaining bloodletters and fleshhounds lost their physical forms, melting into the mud and leaving the orcs as the sole remaining alien threat on the planet. The Imperial commanders capitalized on the shifting environmental conditions, directing all available macro cannons and void shield generators to focus entirely on the massive orc gargants still operating in the ash wastes. The complete physical eradication of the orc presence on Armageddon proved impossible. The green spores seeded deep within the ash wastes continued to produce fresh waves of warriors, ensuring the conflict would persist for generations. The Imperium accepted this permanent state of warfare. The High Lords of Terror officially designated Armageddon as a priority war zone, establishing permanent supply lines to funnel millions of guardsmen and thousands of armored vehicles directly into the meat grinder. The factory workers continued to turn the heavy iron cranks, and the soldiers continued to die in the mud. The physical legacy of the three wars cemented Armageddon's place in the Imperial records, a world defined entirely by the endless cycle of industrial production and planetary-scale slaughter. Well, that brings us to the end of the tale of Armageddon. It's a harsh story, I know, one filled with endless ash, roaring guns, and rivers of blood. But in this galaxy, even the grimmest wars eventually settle into the dust, leaving only the quiet hum of the manufactorums and the wind blowing across the plains. Now, you should rest. Let the crackle of the fire replace the sounds of battle in your mind. Sleep well, traveler, and regain your strength for whatever road lies ahead tomorrow.